Trucktown, A History of International Harvester in Fort Wayne, was brought to you by
Hanning & Bean, a commercial real estate and property management firm invested in the development of Northeast Indiana. Proud to support PBS Fort Wayne in preserving the legacy of International Harvester.
In 1935, Three Rivers Federal Credit Union began as a financial cooperative for the hardworking employees of International Harvester, committed to supporting the people, places, and ideas that make our region home. ThreeRiversFCU.org.
O'Rourke Schoaf Family Foundation, proud to bring the International Harvester story to the community.
Additional funding provided by Kester's Body and Frame Shop, Selking International Trucks, and the City of New Haven.
Fort Wayne is a truck town. And it all started here at the International Harvester Truck Factory.
So somebody said, well, you ought to go with the Harvester. They're trying to hire people.
Many people thought a job with Harvester was a job for life.
I was going to work for the International Harvester.
My employee number was 24936.
Interviewed out of high school.
This was my second job out of high school.
I started second shift. Of course, you had to be on second shift for quite a few years before you ever got on days.
I started in machine shop.
Hired in as just a detailer to begin with.
Handyman, go get this, go get that.
Hired in as a steno 2.
The forge shop on Third Trick. Learned real quick why people wear hard hats.
I worked in the blueprint room and the vault.
I started out on the broom.
I was a janitor on third shift.
Mopped and washed every floor in that building.
Key punch operator.
I started at key punch, and that's all obsolete now.
I started out setting engines in the Scout, on the Scout line.
The line work was tough, and it was hard.
I built some muscles up doing that job.
Just give me the job that maybe has the most overtime and your highest assembly rate. And I ended up down the basement on axle assembly.
You started in with low seniority, you worked the hard jobs.
Opportunity to do a lot of different things.
I worked in the hot room.
You might be a brake engineer one day, but you might be a chassis engineer the next day.
In the cold room.
I was a reliability engineer.
Special equipment engineering.
I worked in SE for a while. I worked in the chassis group for a while.
I was a clay modeler.
You were able to move around from one department to the next.
And I went to warehousing for about 5 years.
I was in the brake department.
I transferred over to the machine shop.
Cab mount.
Parts chaser.
Building housings.
Rail fields, and I worked inside, I worked outside.
The top mounts.
Did brake work, I did steering.
Machine shop where they used to make the parts.
Body mount, which you had to watch your fingers, you had to be timely, quick, and you had to keep up the line.
I was an expediter. Actually, I was a buyer's assistant for a while.
I was an expediting.
Planning department.
Went to timekeeping, which I loved.
I did all the painting for a design group.
Then I worked engine mount. Then I got in on the finished body line.
In my 40 years, I had 16 different jobs.
Well, Grandpa, he says, you never were on a job more than a couple of years until the end. He says, couldn't you hold a job?
This is only a handful of people representing the tens of thousands of people who worked at International Harvester in Fort Wayne, Indiana throughout its 92-year stay in the city. It was a dependable place where a person could get a good paying job and count on working there until the day they were ready to retire.
I started there in '66 in road test as an M140 mechanic.
I hired in 65.
1968.
Late 59, early 60.
60, 61, something like that.
January of 1963.
Started in 1963.
March of 1966.
1966.
1966.
1970.
I started in 1986.
February of '98.
1941.
I worked here a little over 7 years.
I was here 30 years.
35.8 years.
37 years.
And I retired with 37 years.
Ended up working 37 years.
Put in 39 years.
39.7 years.
40 years and a couple weeks.
I had 41 years service.
41.9 years.
So I just got my 50 years in.
I never thought I would last 2 or 3 years, and then I made a career out of it.
Through a good many decades of the 20th century, people like these used their minds and hands to conceive and build vehicles that helped make America. They helped a nation fight our battles. They kept America moving. They gave hard-working Americans something to look forward to on the weekends and captured the hearts of many.
I love old trucks. I've been around trucks all my life.
I'm an IH man, I'll tell you that.
Any old car, any old truck is of interest to someone.
Somewhere along the line, a truck was involved in everything except the air you breathe.
If I can design vehicles for the rest of my life, I'll be the happiest camper you ever saw.
At times, they had 10,000 people working.
The best hourly jobs in the county.
It was good money.
On the line, we made good pay.
At the end of the week, there were some good rewards.
I liked the money.
I enjoyed the pay, I think, most of all, really.
When I come out of school and I went to work there as a trainee, I think I got $3.28 or $3.29 an hour. Now, when I left there, it was close to $7 an hour, It was big money.
I made $15 a week.
If you had a family member, that was a natural pull.
They liked to have families there because they would get on each other's back if they didn't do a good job or they weren't 100% in their attendance.
If that guy's a good worker, maybe his son's a good worker.
My grandfather worked here, my uncle worked here. My wife had several uncles who worked here.
I was the second generation. My daughter worked there, was the third generation.
I worked from 11 o'clock at night till 7 o'clock in the morning. Had class started at 8 o'clock.
It was hard work.
As you got older, you didn't want to do it.
International Harvester says its production will increase by 50% next month when it begins work on 1,800 new Paystar trucks for Iraq.
Production was at its peak. We were producing 205 heavy-duty trucks a day. Most of any heavy-duty truck plant in the world ever did.
We were the king of cab-over-engine trucks.
A lot of manufacturers just build a truck and then you made it the way you wanted it. Harvester built it the way you wanted it right from the beginning.
I'd get around Fort Wayne down there and I would just drool because that was the truck capital of the world. And International, in my opinion, is the best truck ever built.
When they built the Hoover Dam, my gosh, they used all Harvester trucks. I started collecting Scouts in the early 70s.
It was a strong vehicle and it was stiff suspension, but it was very strong. Farmers absolutely loved it.
They know two names. They know Farmall tractors and they know the Scout.
It wasn't fast, but it was a lot of fun.
Very simple vehicle to work on.
After you work on it all winter, and you get it to where you can take off and drive it, turn the radio on, go over to a friend's house. It's pretty cool. There was a lot of pride built Scouts. A lot of people not only built them, but they drove them.
I'd say it was probably the best place to work, and we were very proud of the product that we produced.
We were like one big family.
I loved International Harvester. I breathed it, I ate it, they treated me super, they paid me very, very well. I loved it.
In 1831, 22-year-old Cyrus McCormick perfected a horse-drawn mechanical reaper for harvesting grain. This invention would revolutionize agriculture around the world. McCormick used innovative sales and marketing practices to make his harvesting machine company one of the leading manufacturers of farming equipment in the U.S., producing over 50,000 reapers a year. After his death in 1884, Cyrus McCormick Jr. stepped in to take the reins from his father, but there was a crowded field of competition, with one of the largest competitors being the Deering Harvester Company.
Cyrus Jr. was tired of fighting with his arch rival, William Deering, and there were 300 other reaper makers out there, and it was just difficult to do business. So they merged to form International Harvester with 3 other reaper makers.
The 1902 merger of the 2 major manufacturers, McCormick Harvesting Machine Company and Deering Harvester Company, along with 3 smaller manufacturers, created an industrial juggernaut, the International Harvester Company.
Immediately after the merger, Harvester owned an 85% market share.
Harvester got into the truck manufacturing business by way of the automobile.
Even though the McCormicks and the Deerings had built empires around horse-drawn farming implements, both companies had been working on self-powered vehicles during the 1890s. In the years following the merger, the first tractor appeared in 1906, followed by the auto buggy in 1907. This horseless carriage resembled many of the first automobiles being developed at the time. This led to the development of a more truck-like vehicle called the auto wagon, which debuted in 1909.
We say the auto wagon was developed for farmers, but there are hundreds of pictures of them already as delivery vehicles, serving every industry right from the start, so it wasn't strictly a farm product at all.
The leadership at International Harvester soon saw the potential to branch out from agricultural products to tap into this new market for delivery vehicles. A factory in Akron, Ohio was converted from making farm implements to making these new motor vehicles.
And then in 1912, they started building what they called motor trucks. And that was really where they got into the truck business for the first time.
Even though the company identity was still strongly tied to the McCormick Deering names, and the primary focus remained on the farming business, this new venture was charting a course for the future. International Harvester Company was now a truck manufacturer. By 1910, International Harvester Company had become the nation's largest producer of light trucks, and it was now the 4th largest company in America. The early years of the 20th century witnessed a boom in vehicle production. More and more businesses discovered how useful trucks could be for delivering milk, food goods, and a variety of wares.
As they started with auto wagons, they quickly took over a plant over in Akron, Ohio, but by the teens, that was being outgrown, and they had to expand somehow.
Akron did fine for a number of years. But it was landlocked. There was no room to expand the dimensions of the plant. And Akron didn't have the manpower or the housing. They were running 3 shifts at that plant, and workers were taking turns sleeping in the same room.
Expanding sales paired with an unexpandable factory created quite the dilemma for the International Harvester Company. To alleviate the situation, a former Champion farm equipment factory in Springfield, Ohio, was reconfigured to supplement the production of motor trucks. At the same time, the board resolved to further expand their manufacturing capabilities by constructing a brand new factory solely dedicated to producing motor trucks that would have the capacity to fulfill the increasing orders. A nationwide search was underway to find the ideal location. Representatives from Harvester began contacting city officials and business leaders in 26 different localities. In November 1919, one of those locations was Fort Wayne, Indiana.
They approached the Fort Wayne Chamber of Commerce. Charles Finch was the president, and told them that they were looking at Fort Wayne as a possible site for a new heavy-duty truck plant. But Harvester had said that they wanted a location in the Midwest, so we certainly fit that. And of course, their headquarters were up in Chicago, so we weren't too far from Chicago either. Additionally, they had a plant in Springfield, Ohio, so that was also a plus as far as our location. Harvester said, we're looking to build a plant that's going to cost between $4 and $5 million. We're going to employ 4,000 to 5,000 employees. We're going to produce about 30,000 trucks per year, which is just an astronomical number. Now, the bad news is we want you to form a corporation and fund it with $750,000 to ensure that the other things we need, like public services brought to our site, can be accomplished. They were also considering 25 other cities, so it's not like they were just going to come to Fort Wayne. And in fact, they had some pretty heavy requirements that the city had to meet in order to get the plant here, considering that they were at the edge of town where nothing existed except for farm fields. They wanted a 12-inch water main run to the plant site. They wanted telephone. They wanted electrical. They wanted streetcar service run to the plant site. They also wanted a belt line run to the plant site that would come off of the main railroad tracks. And this belt line could be used equally by the Wabash Railroad, the Nickel Plate Railroad, the New York Central, and the Pennsylvania Railroad. One of the other things they were looking for is they wanted Pontiac Street extended to the site of the factory, which is why we now call Pontiac in this area Pontiac Extended. They also wanted Uter Road widened, and they wanted it run up to the top of the hill to join with Pontiac Street.
While building in a rural area would give the International Harvester Company plenty of room to expand, solving one of the problems they encountered in Akron, it also presented another challenge. How do they house several thousand workers and avoid a repeat of the Akron housing shortage?
One of the requirements that they had was that the Development Corporation have built 1,000 houses for their employees to either buy or rent so that they could live close to the plant.
The Fort Wayne Chamber of Commerce got to work by forming the Greater Fort Wayne Development Corporation to raise the $750,000 necessary to purchase land and build the required housing.
The raising of this $750,000 was a Herculean feat. In 1919, $750,000 was a whole lot of money. Arthur Hall put the pressure on local businesses and businessmen and other wealthy individuals to buy shares in the company and guarantee that they would provide a certain amount of money. The largest providers provided $25,000 each. These were a few individuals like Sam Foster, but they were mostly industry here in Fort Wayne. And Wolf and Dessauer, for example, John Stillman's, who owned the Grand Leader, which later became Stillman's, those kind of individuals. They ended up getting over 200 people in Fort Wayne and businesses to contribute to the fund. And instead of raising $750,000, they raised $1 million.
In April of 1920, International Harvester Vice President Herbert F. Perkins shared with the Board of Directors a unanimous recommendation from the Manufacturing Department to choose Fort Wayne as the location for the new motor truck manufacturing plant. A site was chosen 3 miles east of the city, and 143 acres of land was to be purchased at a cost of $700 per acre.
The site that was decided on for International Harvester, which we now call the East End Industries area, was really just farmland.
My grandfather on my mother's side, that's where they lived. That was their family farm, and they sold the farm to International back in 1920.
The big news was announced in June of 1920. International Harvester would be bringing their motor truck manufacturing factory to Fort Wayne. The plans called for a factory and 2 other buildings with 193,000 square feet under roof. One impressive architectural element of the Fort Wayne works would be a colossal rectangular tower bearing the name International on all 4 sides.
What a lot of people don't realize is that the tower, which is 150 feet tall, housed a 100,000-gallon water tank.
Rising high above the surrounding farmland, The tower could be seen from miles away. It would become an icon of not only the International Harvester Company, but also of Fort Wayne as a home for industry. Shift changes were signaled by a loud steam whistle atop the powerhouse. The distinct tone could be heard for miles around the factory. Willard Bryce Scholl was born in 1921, 2 years before the plant was completed. He and his family lived near the plant and regarded the whistle to be a community timepiece.
We lived by that whistle. I lived not too far down, about 2 blocks. I knew that the timing the people went to work and when they got off. Last whistle was at 12 o'clock. And that was the last one till 7 in the morning. I heard that whistle for years, but I never knew I was going to be working by it.
Construction began in May of 1922. The first truck would roll off the Fort Wayne Works assembly line in December of 1923. Workers would produce 433 trucks by the end of the year. From this point forward, Fort Wayne would be a truck town. Once the full capacity of the factory came online in 1924, a total of 6,831 trucks were made that year. The Model 103 was one of the new truck models being built at the new plant. The rugged truck with a 10,000-pound maximum capacity marked the beginning for Fort Wayne. Things were going well in Fort Wayne in 1924. Plans were announced to expand the works in order to increase production capacity. By 1925, the International Harvester Company had earned its place as the country's largest manufacturer with a full line of trucks. The Akron Works closed that same year. Truck production was now divided between Fort Wayne, Indiana, and Springfield, Ohio, with a third truck plant serving Canada in Chatham, Ontario. Those factories combined to produce about 15,000 trucks in 1926. In 1928, total production reached a record 40,000 units.
International Harvester makes a complete line of trucks, the best that men, money, and more than a century of manufacturing experience can build. The factory at Fort Wayne, where heavy-duty models are manufactured, there are internationals to meet every hauling need, dependably and economically.
The plant complex was expanded to complement the assembly of trucks by adding a forge for making parts and an 80-acre proving grounds facility to test the trucks under extreme conditions. These were signs of a booming economy, and the housing market in Fort Wayne was so strong that the Development Corporation didn't have to use the full $1 million fund to build houses because local builders had stepped in to fill the demand.
Really, when the Depression hit in the fall of 1929, it took a while for it to catch up with Fort Wayne. We kept sailing along for a while because of the diverse industrial base that we had here. But eventually, of course, it caught up with Fort Wayne too, and caught up with International Harvester as well.
The International Harvester Company went from a high of 51,000 trucks produced in 1928 to a Depression-era low of just 17,400 in 1932. During the lean years of the early 1930s, the federal government turned its resources toward public works and infrastructure projects. These big projects called for big trucks.
We supplied 80% of all the trucks to build the Hoover Dam, which was the biggest public works project in the country's history. Customers were asking for more power. And so in '28, we started a deal with the Hall Scott Motor Company. And we created a whole series of trucks that were labeled HS-74 or HS-104 for Hall Scott. Those were big, severe duty trucks. Many of those built the Hoover Dam.
In this early stage of the work, millions of yards of rock and dirt were to be removed. A fleet of over 100 international heavy-duty trucks was selected by the 6 companies, summer and winter, working 24 hours a day, through choking dust and biting wind, in temperatures as high as 120 and in cold, often below freezing.
Things were much heavier duty. We were building really big trucks. Drastic changes from the 20s.
Whatever the destination, these heavy-duty trucks are ready and able to go. Such flexibility and ability to work has never been equaled by any other form of transportation, and the adaptation of trucks to specific jobs is still in its beginning.
While raw power was what was needed on the construction site, over-the-road long-haul trucking at sustained highway speeds required a different kind of power, especially climbing the steep grades of the western mountains.
Hills coming out of Los Angeles, a 13-mile upgrade, that would take them an hour and a half to 2 hours to get up the hill. You were down in low gear at 5 to 10 mile an hour.
Dealers on the West Coast were getting asked for more power. In our severe duty trucks, we went with the Hall Scott engines. For our over-the-road trucks, our dealers out west were taking one of the bigger D series trucks apart, extending the hood and putting a Cummins engine in it. Because these guys were hauling double trailers over the mountains, and our own international engines weren't able to power that. So we started working with Cummins, and we still do today.
Each field of hauling presents a different array of problems. Yet, for each of these fields, International offers a complete line of heavy-duty trucks in both 4- and 6-wheel types.
The decade of the 1930s would end under the shadow of a dark cloud of uncertainty cast by the escalating conflict in Europe and Asia. By the summer of 1940, France had surrendered to Germany, and Great Britain was under siege from the relentless Nazi air attacks.
We were anticipating that we were going to get into the war, and we were planning, at least ahead of time.
The M14 and M24 were in response to an invitation to bid for a contract for the rearmament programs that were coming in 1939 and 1940, because we knew we were going to be in a war sooner or later. So they were building up our military and making orders of different kinds of equipment.
December 7, 1941, America was stunned by the news that war had come to the U.S. in a surprise attack at Pearl Harbor. The United States and its allies would have to mobilize military forces on a scale never seen before. Battles would be waged across vast distances, over the most difficult terrain, and in every kind of extreme weather. Logistics would be a vital part of supplying Allied troops with everything they needed to win the war. To do the job, it would take thousands of trucks from every vehicle manufacturer in the U.S.
Mobility is the essence of modern war, and America's motorized forces must be kept rolling. Over at the Fort Wayne Works, plant facilities are being used for the manufacture of military trucks.
Wartime production had begun. Fort Wayne continued to build heavy-duty trucks and some medium-duty models. Springfield built half-tracks, along with light-duty trucks and early four-wheel drive vehicles.
There was an M14 and an M24 and an M34. The M14 was a half-ton, the M24 was a 1-ton, and the M34 was a 1.5 tons. Those were the very first four-wheel drive vehicles that International Harvester built.
We sold mostly to the Navy and the Marine Corps. Those were our two biggest customers. A lot of what we sold were commercial trucks that were painted to be military trucks, and maybe some minor modifications, but they were essentially commercial trucks.
A lot of it was a continuation of their civilian models because trucks were still needed. So they built, let's say, regular trucks an awful lot here compared to some other places that were strictly military production.
Some of the civilian models were K-7 dump trucks. The U.S. Army ordered 700 from the Fort Wayne Works. Fort Wayne engineers designed vehicles to meet military specifications. Then, prototypes underwent rigorous testing at the Fort Wayne Proving Grounds.
The performance of the military units is tested on the proving ground just the same way all the guesswork is taken out of the standard truck. International trucks are rolling on the Burma Road and driving across the hot sands of Africa and doing yeoman service with friendly foreign powers, all under the toughest possible conditions. Others are serving our armed forces right here.
Harvester knows how to build them for any kind of service, anywhere.
We tested trucks that were going to be in even more difficult situations than bad roads in Europe or wherever they were headed. We not only tested what we designed and built in Fort Wayne, but we also tested what we built at Springfield. And we tested other makers' trucks on our test track because it was the best.
One of the government-designed heavy-duty military vehicles being built at the Fort Wayne Works was the M56. The M was for military, 5 for 5,000-pound or 2.5-ton capacity, and 6 for 6 wheels. A 6x6 designation meant it was a 6-wheel drive vehicle.
The M56 was probably the best deuce and a half built during the war, especially the M5H6, which was a specialty version that the Marine Corps used because it was a high mobility 6x6.
The 6x6s, yeah, in some cases, that was the only way they were going to get through the roads until they could fix them enough to run lesser capable vehicles down them.
An M5H6 6x6 International 2.5 ton could blow the doors off the GMC CCKW.
One other widely produced vehicle was the M5 half-track, engineered and tested in Fort Wayne, but built in Springfield. For the most part, like many of the heavy-duty trucks being built in the Fort Wayne Works, these vehicles would be shipped overseas to our allies as part of the Lend-Lease program.
Lend-Lease was a program to supply our allies with military equipment because we were fighting the war as a group. Some of the allies were in the process of being bombed, so some of their production capability was being destroyed as a result of the war, and they needed equipment a lot faster than they were getting it from their own sources. International Harvester was a primary supplier of trucks and half-tracks to the Soviet Union and to the British.
The U.S. Army had a major concern with the thousands of trucks it was putting into service. Once they were in the field of battle, there was still a need for maintenance and repair. With such a large fleet of vehicles under their command, the Army came to the manufacturers asking for qualified mechanics willing to serve. International responded by recruiting from its factories and dealerships, putting together and training a group of field mechanics that would become known as the Harvester Battalion. The 134th Ordnance Maintenance Battalion would go on to be cited for meritorious services repairing trucks, tanks, and half-tracks on the front lines in France and Germany.
Our employees get together as a group and all enlist and get trained as mechanics. Even many of them weren't mechanics in their day jobs at the company, and then go off and repair, maintain all kinds of international vehicles, even on the front lines. I mean, it was dangerous work, and they were all proud to do it and did it really well.
Company-wide, over 13,000 International Harvester employees enlisted in some form of military service during the war. This left thousands of vacant jobs that needed to be filled to meet the wartime production demands. World War II provided women and minorities with new employment opportunities unlike any other time in our nation's history.
We had an anti-discrimination policy that we issued in 1919. We were way ahead of our time, but our plants were not very integrated until the war.
The Fort Wayne Works gained a tenuous connection with one of the legendary Tuskegee Airmen thanks to former employee Maxine Hall. Her husband, Charles B. Hall, was the first African American to shoot down a Nazi aircraft during a dogfight in Italy. He would go on to fly 198 combat missions, earn the rank of Major, and receive the Distinguished Flying Cross. Eventually, all the hard work would pay off. The Allies would see victory in Europe and Asia. Americans celebrated as loved ones returned home, and life slowly fell back into its normal pace. For the International Harvester Company, the return to normal would bring record sales. In 1948, truck production hit a new high of 172,000 vehicles, and Fort Wayne did its part by building 46,955 trucks. Between 1945 and 1948, the company hired 30,000 new employees nationwide and added 6 factories, including a new truck plant in Emeryville, California, producing the Western W Series, designed for the mountains of the West Coast. A new product line, the International Harvester refrigerator, was also being manufactured at one of the newly acquired factories.
We had excess manufacturing capacity because we expanded so much during the war. We probably made some bad decisions. Instead of modernizing some of our truck and tractor plants, we got into side businesses. We got into non-core businesses. We were building refrigerators and freezers. We were building lawn tractors.
As America turned the corner from the war-fueled 1940s into the domestic baby boom decade of the 1950s, the International Harvester Fort Wayne plant complex had grown to include 31 buildings with 40 acres under roof on a total of 124 acres of land. By 1950, 500,000 trucks had rolled off the assembly line of the Fort Wayne Works. Employment levels fluctuated between 5,500 and 6,000 workers. The increased sales brought on by post-war optimism and a booming economy caused some growing pains at the Fort Wayne Works.
Management wanted design and engineering to come together in one location.
As things kept getting bigger and bigger, they decided we don't have enough room over in the main plant for all these people that we're going to need.
Ground was broken in July of 1950 for the construction of a new motor truck engineering department and laboratories in Fort Wayne. This 250,000 square foot, $8 million facility would be a place where planning, design, and testing all came together.
It's critical to have all those people in the same place, on the same page.
Everything was designed here and, for the most part, built here.
You look under a hood, there's almost no room for another anything in there. And our designers would be arguing about the slope of a hood, and the engineers would be telling them about all the other pieces of equipment that still need to go under that hood.
To make one truck, you've got hundreds, literally thousands of parts that go into that truck.
In order for all of these parts to fit together, it takes careful planning, precise drawings, and a whole lot of engineering know-how.
All this has to come together and work together to build a vehicle that doesn't fail, has high reliability. And so we would have hundreds of engineers to design one truck, different kinds of engineers, some electrical, some mechanical, some test engineers. We did all the new product development, so all the new trucks. We did all the sustaining engineering. To develop a truck takes years to do it, right? And even then, you're accelerated testing. A lot of design, a lot of test, redesign, retest, validate, and then you got to make sure they can all be produced. It takes hundreds of people, thousands of man hours to develop a product like that that's acceptable in the marketplace, is safe and reliable and durable.
Trucks had many moving parts, and so the center where these trucks were designed and tested had to be multifunctional and comprehensive.
TDTC, Truck Development and Technology Center, covered programs that we would do. It would cover chassis engineering, electrical engineering, body engineering, test engineering. We had the test track out here, so we would design things, we'd put them on tests. We'd do it at the test track as well as we'd run trucks literally all over the United States.
Putting so much money and resources into designing and building a truck wouldn't make sense if no one wanted to buy it. International Harvester made listening to what the customer wanted a priority.
The first thing you really have is the market input. Who's this product going to be sold to, and what do you want it to do? And then it goes to the engineers to really create a set of specifications for the product. How many miles should this last? What kind of roads is it going to run under? What's it going to haul? Those sorts of things. How's the customer really going to use it? Creates this specification, and then the engineers sit down and they start to develop the truck, and it's really developed on paper. This is the motor we'll put in it. This is the transmission. This is the axles. How big are the frame rails? How big does the radiator need to be? And so the engineers will start putting this on paper. And at some point, it goes from kind of the specifications to a set of drawings.
These drawings had to be very precise and very detailed. Not just major components, but every seemingly insignificant screw, washer, nut, and bolt had to be represented.
Every part that we used.
It took an army of engineers and draftsmen to produce the drawings that would be needed for all phases of development, testing, and production. This all took place in one huge space at the Engineering Center in Fort Wayne.
It was called the drafting room, the design room. And when I started, that was all open, and there was 8-foot and 10-foot and 12-foot drafting boards. And as a young detailer, you got the small drafting boards. And I'd tell you, coming in here in 1986, it looked like NASA. Everyone wore a white shirt with a tie. But what was going on in there was all the hard work of getting drawings ready, or bills of material ready, or detailed drawings, or assembly drawings of how to build those products. We had hundreds of engineers in there, and designers and detailers doing that work in there.
In those early years, drafting was an entirely different program than what we have today. We were actually drawing on linen. After that, we went to Mylar, and from Mylar, then you went into the CAD-CAM, or as we know it today, the computerized drafting and design.
So in that room, there's many, many groups. You had a powertrain group that was responsible for putting the engines in and transmissions and axles in. There was a brake group specifically to what brakes are we going to put on this product. There was a body group, and the body group had interiors and exteriors. And you had an electrical group. The electrical group started out was just running all wires and quickly transitioned to electronics on these trucks. What tires are you going to put on the truck, and what wheels are you going to put on the truck, and what fifth wheel will you put on the truck? And the chassis group was not just the chassis, but it was the radiator, and it was all the mounting and the rear suspension mounting. And so there was many, many groups represented in those hundreds of designers and engineers and draftspeople in that room. And so there was a lot of interaction between all the different groups to make sure that everything fit together and worked together. All the stages kind of that a part would go through, it starts with putting it on what we call the layout, either the whole truck or a portion of the truck where that part's going. How does it fit with everything else going around there? Typically, if our prototype shop here could do it, our prototype shop would make the part. You'd have a sample, and then it would go to the mechanics who would install that part on the truck and make sure it fit. And the guys start putting it together, putting all those parts together. And invariably, they start saying, this isn't going to work. You can't put this together in the manufacturing facility.
Engineering would design a part, and then if they had trouble with it on the line, they'd blame the guys on the assembly line for not knowing how to put it on, and they'd blame engineering for not knowing how to design it.
It might be surprising, but sometimes engineers design things that can't be put together.
Even if all the parts actually fit together, it doesn't necessarily mean they will work together.
And you start to test it. And that's where you start to find out, hey, you know, we did this virtually, but in the real world, these temperatures are higher, or these stresses are higher. And so then you would go through kind of a phase of redesign and prototype and redesign. This is taking years. A typical truck, if you could do it in 4 years, that's pretty good. Most new products would take 5 years, but you go from the design to building some parts, to building a truck, to testing that truck. And then you would go through a couple cycles of that, and then you actually go to the manufacturing plant probably a year before you have everything tooled up. Can we build it in the plant? And then that last year is really just preparing for production. If that was successful, then we'd go back and we would tool that part. The tooling is the parts to make that part, or the tools to make that part. So some parts are stamped, some parts are forged, some parts are cast. That process for tooling a part could be anywhere from a few days to a few months. And then once that is in, we would have what we called PBAs, Production Brake Authority, where in a certain day we would switch over from the old part to the new part. You'd have to make sure that all the parts that interfaced with were available, all the suppliers were ready to ship, and we had parts at the plant. The biggest disasters were if a plant can't build, it's not a good day for the engineers.
Before a truck could go into production, every part had to be tested. First, the parts were tested on an individual level. Then, assembled units like transmissions and engines were tested for functionality and durability. Finally, a complete prototype truck was submitted to various kinds of testing under extreme conditions. Engineers created different types of environments for testing the limits of the products they were designing. The Shaker Lab was meant to simulate the jarring conditions a truck might encounter on a construction site or driving thousands of miles on rough roads.
There was a couple different kinds of shakers. One was you would just put a cab on, and you could shake a hood, you could shake a radiator, you could shake a cab. And it really simulated, if you think about going over railroad tracks as an example. You can drive over a railroad track so many times a day, but if you could get over it 100 times a day, that's probably a lot to drive over a railroad track. Literally, you could drive over a railroad track on a shaker every 5 seconds.
What's going to shake loose in 50,000 miles? What's going to fatigue? What's just going to work loose?
It was not a gentle little thing. It shook like you'd think the windshield would pop out. I mean, it was serious.
Because international trucks were used worldwide, they had to be able to function in some of the most extreme temperatures on the planet, from scorching desert heat to snow-covered mountain roads. The Fort Wayne engineers created special lab environments to simulate sweltering heat in the hot room and sub-zero temperatures in the cold room, with the capacity to go as low as -100 degrees Fahrenheit.
I'd say the majority of the tests were 40 below.
You're 40 below zero, a soft seat is a rock.
Yeah. Well, you break a power steering line in there and just shoot webs of oil out like strings.
And it would be solid.
Yeah.
It'd look like strawberry taffy.
These extreme temperatures not only tested the limits of what a truck could endure, but also the limits of what the human body could endure. The cold room had specific guidelines to prevent serious injury to the personnel working inside. Special gear had to be worn, and strict time limits were observed, depending on the testing temperature.
Time limit in the cold room, I think it was 15 minutes.
15 minutes, then when you were 70 or 80 below, it was like 5 minutes.
Yeah, that was in an 8-hour period.
At the other end of the spectrum, extreme heat posed a different set of challenges to operating a truck. Testing had to be done in a specially designed, controlled environment with a multitude of measuring devices.
Had a hot room where we could run in 120-degree temperatures.
A room that we could put a truck in, full-size tractor, fairly good size. We could put a small school bus in there. We had dynamometers in the floor. We put the driving wheels on that. We strap them down. We had a 7 or 8 foot fan upstairs that was a loop that would blow the air. Try to run at 100-degree temperature room. When we first started, we would run maybe 10 temperature devices to measure different temperatures. And as the engineers, they needed more and more data. We might have 150 temperature devices. We'd measure water flows, we'd measure oil flows, we'd measure all kinds of pressures. We had tons and tons of data. We worked real hard to try to duplicate conditions that truck would see in real life. We would run that truck full throttle, as much fuel as it could burn. The exhaust systems ran a lot hotter, so we would run temperatures of things around the exhaust, and so we'd have to put heat shields. It took days to set a vehicle up, but we might run it for a week or two. We ran 24/7 a lot of times.
Same truck.
Same truck.
In order to design and build a reliable and safe truck, engineers often had to bring components to the point of failure to find design flaws, reveal weaknesses in materials, or establish safe operating limits for a product. This involved using some creative methods to invent tests that could push products beyond their breaking point.
One of the tests we did, we had a clutch test facility, which one of the things you have to worry about on a clutch is if it gets oversped, it may explode and pieces go flying out in every direction right under your feet. So it was a concrete chamber in the ground where they could mount a clutch there, which was like mounting it on the back of an engine really, and then just spin it at a high speed to see if it definitely survives beyond the 3,000 RPM or whatever the engine is going to spin it. And often I'm sure they ran it to what speed would it finally explode to know what its capabilities was.
Another factor that affected truck development was government regulation. Vehicle manufacturers had to meet certain federal standards before they could put a truck on the market. This required engineers to perform specialized testing under very strict standards.
It was a large part through the 80s, 90s, and even up till now is the government regulations. A lot of investment to meet the regulations. Every 3 years or every 4 years, we had a new emission standard. And so we would have to go in and it'd be a new engine installation, a new radiator installation, cooling, after treatment, and so it became a large part of what we did here.
Government noise regulations were the impetus for the construction of an entirely new testing site solely devoted to the measurement of sound caused by trucks. A looping section of paved road known as the Sound Test Facility was nestled in a wooded area just behind the engineering center.
We had it somewhat shrouded so we didn't get a lot of noise from the road or from anything else, and we would drive trucks down. We were trying to get to 80 dBA drive-by noise so that the trucks were quieter. We had a whole group of people that worked on noise development, noise suppression.
Driving down the road, the roar of the tires was the only thing you could hear. Finally had to build a facility here where we could really measure what the effect of a change to the truck is. Tires, mufflers, fan, everything.
We would do different things like putting insulation around engines or insulation around the hoods of trucks, or changing how the gears were cut in a transmission to reduce the noise of the truck. And so all that testing was done here right on the backside of this facility. The brake regulations were the same thing during that time frame. They wanted them shorter and shorter for great reasons, right? We want trucks that can stop. And then that required us to go to ABS brakes, which required a whole nother level of development and testing and capability associated with that.
The DOT added about $2,100 per chassis in our cost to meet that standard.
When we first started doing brake tests, we didn't have the anti-skid systems, and you'd have to hit the brake pedal hard enough to stop as quick as you could without locking a wheel. And you kind of built your way up to speed. Well, when they came out with this anti-skid brakes, we didn't have any more of that. You went out and you did a 60-mile-an-hour panic stop, we called them. Yeah, right. And you talk about something, that make you pucker up on that seat. You come around that curve, as soon as you hit the flat, you had to stab that brake and hope it worked, because you...
Right. That truck, bear in mind, you're going down the road 80,000 pounds. That's the max, but it had to stop in X number of feet.
The Cargo Star was short, and that thing would jump from one axle to the other. You remember that truck?
Yeah.
Oh, it'd just about kill you.
Donnie Gerardo lost a rear axle doing a full dump.
It was something
stop.
to watch. That truck would
it was so severe,
this.
it just ripped the axle out.
Oh, it's crazy.
Well, I know they built a 9670 with a real short wheelbase at one time.
Remember that?
And it would almost go on its nose when you guys hit the brakes.
Yeah,
the rear end would come off the ground. So they didn't sell them. They turned around, we went to a longer frame on it.
The Proving Grounds, a very important external facility with a 1.2-mile banked oval track, was where testing was done on fully assembled vehicles under extreme driving conditions.
The purpose of the Proving Grounds test track was really just to speed up testing. These trucks, some of them will last 1 million miles. Well, how do you put 1 million miles on a truck? in a few years. You can't. And so you accelerate test them. That's what we did at the test track.
At the Proving Ground track at Fort Wayne, Indiana, drivers wear them out if they can.
There's what we call events, whether it's a turning event where you turn the truck, or whether it's going over a rough bump, or whether it's putting it through the twist course. Those are things you can accelerate at the test track. Areas where we could fill up and run trucks through water to speed up rusting or corrosion and things like that.
The Belgian blocks, scientifically constructed rough roads, deal out their punishment to the springs, the steering mechanism, the cab and the cab mountings, and every part of the body.
They were cobblestones. They were randomly put so the chassis was jumping up and down.
That would verify chassis and the most common things that would break down, suspensions and things like that.
Our drivers could only drive for a few hours at a time because it physically would wear you out driving through a Belgian block course.
The toughest test of all, the twist course. Imagine the terrific stress upon every fiber of the truck structure as it surges back and forth, always under full load. There's strain on the frame, the steering mechanism, the springs, every chassis part, the cab, hood, and grille. Whenever a vehicle can withstand that stress for hour after hour, it has proved beyond doubt that it's worthy of manufacture.
Every truck was different because of the wheelbase, how it would twist. And sometimes when they build it too rigid, it would break.
When you first start using it, you try to fight the steering wheel to keep it straight.
Best thing to do is just
take your hands off of it, and always come back.
They added rumble strips and chuck holes and what they called inverted swales. As you hit them, maybe the back tires would even come off the ground. They were that severe. Then the engineers would pick and choose what events they wanted a vehicle to cycle through to get the miles.
and then they'd evaluate the data, and then that would determine which events created the most stress on the vehicle, for lack of a better term.
You'd start out, you'd have a couple thermocouples to do temperatures. In the end, if the engineer had so many channels on the computer, that's what they wanted to use. You had wires all over that truck, and it looked like it was something on life support.
Because the testing often called for unconventional driving conditions, some of the events seemed more like carnival rides than actual scientific exercises.
That power off lane change, first time we ever did that, I set up cones and unhooked the power steering pump and run it through this maneuver, and they were looking to check and see how much effort it took on the steering wheel with no power steering assist. Don was driving. We got through it and got over there on the west side. I was laughing like a schoolgirl. He said, "What's the matter with you?" I said, "Well, most places you got to pay to go into Cedar Point and get rides like this, but they're paying us good money, and it's just as good."
When the Fort Wayne Works started producing the rugged four-wheel drive Scout in the 1960s, a different kind of testing philosophy was called for to explore the limits of this new off-road, all-purpose vehicle.
The engineer would tell you, just go out and run it hard, you know, do what you can to break it, just go out and beat on it, and that was fun.
Semi laps around the track on the block and whatever, you'd have to come in and hose down the shocks, just keep them catching on fire.
After a couple days of busting the truck, they would usually come out and say, "Well, hold it down a little bit, you know, see if we can get it to last."
Back when we were building Scouts and Travelos, we had to crash them.
Yeah.
We had a barrier out the track where we wouldn't drive them into it. They put them on
We had one guy.
a dolly that we had dummy, didn't we? We had dummies in them, but we had a dolly they'd put it on, and it would run it into the crash barrier at a certain speed, and they had all kinds of high-speed cameras taking pictures. And
They had a rail they ran down to keep it straight.
40-mile-an-hour crash. They pushed it with another vehicle, a push vehicle, and then you had a certain point where you stopped, and they had it calculated that would go into the wall at 40.
Other fleets of test trucks
Take the cross-country roads far from the factories, over the same kind of highways and under the same conditions your trucks and the other fellows' trucks must operate. Every test truck, no matter where it's operating, is loaded to capacity. Those weights aren't wood. They're 1,000-pound blocks of concrete or cast iron.
The roads that we had back then weren't at 69. It was all these back crossroads that I don't know how they got anywhere.
Tests under actual operating conditions are essential, so with new coats of red paint, they're off to the highways and the byways, regardless of the weather.
They had a route all the way around town that included some city driving, interstate driving, and it was kind of a loop that went all around Fort Wayne, included a little bit of 69, come back through town and back to the shop.
Our first area was over at Rochester, Indiana. We had to have a right angle leg so we could compensate for the wind. So I would go south from Rochester down to Peru, and then we go over to 24, and then we do that like three laps a day. And then eventually, after they started with 69, we would run 69. Then they did 469, and that made so we could have another right angle leg.
We'd take and run down 69 and maybe one gear below high or maybe high gear, depending on what the gearing was. The truck was fully loaded and one guy had run the instrumentation, the other guy just drive.
Some vehicles that they required, their test was, I think it was 5,000 was like the lowest amount, and then they rechecked emissions, and then they did some trucks up to 50,000 miles.
We got into the fuel economy things and different air deflectors and things like that. That's what these people would run. They'd run comparisons to see how much you gained on fuel efficiency by making these changes.
Once a truck model has been designed, engineered, and tested, only then was it ready for mass production. The factory assembly line is where designs become reality. At the Fort Wayne Works, heavy-duty trucks were assembled on a massive factory floor the length of 4 football fields.
It was quite an operation.
As far as you could see as a line of trucks coming down the assembly line, that was almost intimidating, to say the least.
It ran almost the full length of the building.
I always liked getting inside a factory. You're seeing the birth of a truck. Now, some people, well, it's just a truck, you just put it together. I don't see it that way. That is the birth of a piece of equipment that is assembled together, and how it all happens is still amazing, that you get to drive that thing off at the end of the line and starts most of the time.
The factory floor was where the main truck assembly took place. Some parts, like axles and tires, were fed up from a sublevel. Cabs were pre-assembled and fed down the line by the overhead conveyor. The Fort Wayne Works had the capacity and workforce to produce over 200 heavy-duty trucks per day. This was accomplished by running 2 assembly lines simultaneously for 2 shifts per day. A separate factory was added in 1960 for the production of the new Scout in Fort Wayne. Even though the end products from both factories were quite different, the production methods remained quite similar.
The frames came in from the outside and people started building them.
You took the frame, you added the axles, you added all the brake lines to the chassis and everything, and then you'd put on tires and you'd go from the overhead conveyor to the floor conveyor, and then you'd come in with the radiator and the engine and down the road the cab, and away you go. Front end, hood and fenders, and keep going.
At the end of the line, it would go to a station called roll test, where they would put the vehicle on a rolling road, and the vehicle would be tested in 2-wheel drive and 4-wheel drive, and it would be run a certain amount of time on the rolling road and make sure everything worked properly. And then it would go to final inspection, where somebody would go through and look at the mechanicals, but make sure the doors were hung right, the mirrors were on properly, there was no big paint flaws, or the grill wasn't put on upside down, or things like that.
While all of these different parts were being assembled, the entire line was on a conveyor system that was constantly moving. Parts had to be placed and ready to go at each station along the way in order to keep the carefully orchestrated ballet moving using a system that followed line set tickets.
A line set ticket is basically the build sheet for the vehicle. They would use those to set the lineup. Okay, they know on March 18th, they're going to build so many Travelers with blue interiors and 345 engines or 6-cylinder engines or whatever it was, and they would have all those parts on the line at the right stations so that when that vehicle rolled down the line, that VIN number, all those parts would be there. And they used the line setting tickets to set all that up.
Everything had to be on when it got to you so that you could do your job.
Each assembly worker had to constantly perform with precision timing.
One truck after another, about 30 minutes apart, you had to get your job done when it come into the next station.
You have a certain pace you got to be on. So if you don't do it, then you're behind. That line just keeps going.
You hustled. You had to keep up with that line. And it was hard work.
Surely, after so much hustling, there would be a point where someone could hit the pause button and everyone could take a minute or two to catch their breath, right?
No, you never stopped the line. It had to be real critical to shut it down. If that line stopped, a light would come on in Chicago. They'd know it right now. And you better have a good reason.
Under no circumstances as an expediter did you shut the lines down. It just didn't happen. If that happened or you were going to be short, you not only had the works buyer and your boss and him, you had the works manager at your desk.
With the line continuously moving at a relentless pace, it was possible for mistakes to happen. A bolt could go untightened, an unwanted option might be added, or a critical step could be missed. It was the inspector's job to make sure this kind of thing didn't go uncorrected.
And that assembler had a line set ticket, and about every 12 jobs you had an inspector. He checked those 10 stations on the one before against that line set ticket, and he had a breakdown of this code gives right-hand drive, this code gives power steering, this code gives manual transmission. Well, that's his number one checks, that it's built to order, and number two, that it's built properly.
Checking off critical things, making sure the nuts and everything were on tight, and they put the tires on there and checked that, and door fit, the steering, the pinch bolts, the brake lines, that was the operator had to sign them off, and you had to check it and sign it off too. And if you'd miss something, they'd come back and you'd get in trouble.
By the end of 1963, over 1 million trucks had rolled off the assembly line of the Fort Wayne Works. International had established a reputation for building reliable, heavy-duty trucks, and they sustained brand loyalty by getting input from their customers and letting their dealers take custom orders.
And they did very well at it. They made some nice stuff. They had some beautiful product, and they sold millions of them.
We were always proud to sell one of those trucks and sell it to a customer. And yeah, they had their fair share of, normal things that would go wrong with them, but they were put together very well.
They built the best heavy-duty truck. They did for years.
Commercial sales were the bulk of the heavy-duty truck orders. With America selling and moving more goods than ever, over-the-road trucking was big business. In the 1960s and 70s, Harvester was winning huge orders from major trucking companies.
They were a fleet truck company. You had your big carriers, you had Schneider, you had North American, you had Ryder, Feld, Saunders Leasing. That was the heart of International Harvester right there. Them guys kept the lights on at International Harvester.
Fort Wayne was the heavy-duty truck plant for International, and Springfield was the light duty. The pickups and travel-alls, that sort of thing, were down there.
I'd get around Fort Wayne down there, and I would just drool because that was the truck capital of the world. And International, in my opinion, is the best truck ever built.
Fort Wayne was the heavy-duty truck capital of the world simply because we were building the most heavy-duty trucks.
We were producing 205 heavy-duty trucks a day. most of any heavy-duty truck plant in the world ever did.
One of the best-selling types of trucks being manufactured in Fort Wayne were COEs, which stood for cab-over engine, also called cab-overs.
We were the king of cab-over engine trucks, so we had a number of different models on the road. 4 years in a row during the 60s, we were the sales leader.
Cab-over is an engine that has the cab sitting on top of the engine rather than having a hood out the front.
In the 60s, we were building all those cab-over trucks because of the government length laws.
We had a 55-foot length wall back then.
There was an overall length of a truck, so the smaller the cab, the longer the trailer, the more things you could haul, the more money you would make.
The advantage was you could pull as long a trailer as possible. Disadvantage is they're more uncomfortable, harder riding, more expensive to build.
International's reign as the cab-over kings would eventually come to an end once the federal truck length laws were relaxed.
In the 70s, they finally lengthened the things out so you could have a truck with the hood out front, and that made a big shift in production plans because you had to make more of those rather than the COs, which, well, finally completely died by about the year 2000.
In addition to the cab-over and conventional over-the-road semi-trucks, an International heavy-duty truck chassis could be customized and adapted for many purposes, including dump trucks, wreckers, school buses, and fire trucks. Sometimes a business would need to have a truck custom engineered to fulfill a specific purpose. This was a job for the Special Equipment Department.
We would engineer whatever the customer wanted.
We worked on sold truck orders that was not regular production. They wanted something on a truck that was special, and that's why we were called Special Equipment. Different fuel tanks, different things mounted on different parts of the chassis. It came to our group and we designed it and engineered it.
Big ones were some of the oil field and Arabian desert models specifically built for that.
Here at Fort Wayne, that was their biggest specialty. It was the enormous trucks built for the oil fields. A lot of them were based on the Paystar, which was our super severe duty truck.
Those trucks were special from front to rear. Some of the chassis were exploration chassis. They were called thumper chassis. They would thump the ground and they would take a reading. They had huge wheels and tires on them, so they could do that.
Looks like it's 80 feet long and 2 stories high. Those were just incredible trucks. Custom engineered, obviously.
It was a DF 8011 6x4, headed for the oil fields in North Africa.
And which one are you in this picture, Bobby?
Right there. Louise Hewitt, Mina Joe Sweet, and Jan Bushy.
International Harvester says its production will increase by 50% next month when it begins work on 1,800 new Paystar trucks for Iraq. The sale to Iraq, the biggest sale in Harvester history, was completed this week.
The Paystars were offered with a steel cab or an aluminum cab, and all the oil field trucks had aluminum cabs because they were afraid that a steel cab might conduct electricity of a spark or something to light the whole truck on fire. So they all used aluminum cabs, but they sold all over the world.
We had this huge order for Iran. The Shah ordered them, and the Shah got kicked out of office, was overthrown, and then Iran just turned to flip-flop. So now we got all this inventory. We were putting Class 7-8 vehicles on their shores off of the boats, and they would sit in the shipyard. People were making houses out of.
With Fort Wayne being the heavy-duty truck capital of the world, it was easy to forget that International Harvester was founded on the agricultural business. One special project reconnected the Fort Wayne Engineering Center back to its farming roots.
We always farmed with International Harvester equipment. I was the owner of the very first 1460 rotary combine.
When they were developing the axial flow combines, which was a secret program, the Hinsdale engineering facility didn't have the capacity to actually build it. Our road test people had excess capacity. They moved them in, they assembled them here in the engineering center. And sure, it was kept quiet. Some people from Ag came down here to work with them on it.
They built the prototypes at the truck plant here because they were afraid of spies. You know,
commercial espionage.
If you're coming up with something new, you don't want the competitors to know it, and this was a totally new design. So they kept it as quiet as they could.
Nobody was really watching the truck plant for combines. They were watching East Moline, seeing what kind of new stuff they were coming out with. It took everybody by surprise because it was a totally different design.
The McCormick Reaper, the Farmall tractor, and our next most important project ever probably was the Axial Flow Combine. I mean, it's the first single rotor combine. That technology is used by every combine maker today.
All the styling for all the international trucks came out of this facility.
Engineers often designed and drafted parts, but another important area of design is styling. Styling combines elements of aesthetics with function to make the truck more appealing to the end customer.
In general, the truck industry is conservative. Of course, International probably was in many respects. At the same time, the design business is supposed to reach. So it was always sort of a tension. It was always just, we want you to do something new, and we're certainly not going to tell you where to stop, but you can't go too far because there's going to be some legitimate reason why that's not a good place to be.
What they do, they try to make manufacturable, because they can come up with a lot of designs that can't be easily built.
You pretty much have to have an idea of what's reasonable when you start. Practicality is everything. A truck has to work and has to last. You sure don't want to design anything that gets in the way of function. You want to assist function wherever you can.
I think styling and design are critical to truck sales. Some people have said selling a Class 8 highway tractor is like selling 2% milk. They're all really just the same, and I think it's the styling or the design that can separate you from the crowd.
Just like engineering and testing a truck was a long, arduous process, styling involved a lot of trial and error as well.
You generally work on more than one project at a time, and in a year's time you've worked on 20 different things or so, and you always want to see all of them succeed, and really very few of them do. We did what you call wallpapering. If there was a new project, you'd get several designers on it, maybe 3, 4, even 5, and they would turn out as many designs as they could, and you would just paper the walls with all these choices, some of them ridiculous, some of them gorgeous, some of them not practical, whatever. And they would start narrowing it down, pushing it down to where finally one of their designs was selected to be developed. You were always doing a lot of work, and most of it didn't go anyplace. Interiors were more complicated and more critical. You've got everything from dashboard instruments to door panels with window cranks that have to work, and pedals that have to be where your feet are, and seats that have to be comfortable, and all those kinds of things, working with a tremendous number of different engineers and suppliers.
Once the two-dimensional drawings for a body styling design were approved, it was time to take it to the third dimension.
There were stylists and there were sculptors, and the stylists do the pretty drawings of the trucks, and then they give those drawings to the sculpting staff, and we just kind of interpret that into a three-dimensional form. We started with a regular full-size clay model. They didn't do very many scale models at Harvester. Trucks are huge, right? I would say thousands of pounds of clay. But the clay is only maybe 3 inches thick. Underneath that is a big buck, we called it, that's made out of wood with styrofoam on the outside. It's very easily carved, so you can put any shape on there you want. You can change it as many times as you want to, which happens daily. The design changes over time. I mean, it takes a good year or so to get this all refined. So you're always coming in every day and tweaking. They'll come in then and say, well, I don't like where that line is on the side. Can you move that a little bit? Or the swoop in the fender doesn't look right. Can we change that?
The goal was to make the full-sized clay model look just like a real painted metal vehicle, but the clay couldn't be painted directly.
The clay models, they would use a thing called Dynoc, which is very close to a decal. So I would paint that, and then they'd put it on the vehicle.
You bring it back and you put it in water, just like you would put a decal on a model airplane or something. You soak this big sheet in water and unroll it and stick it right on the side and squeegee it down really fine. Sometimes we wouldn't put the grill on. We wouldn't model it in because they didn't know what they wanted it to look like yet. They had different ideas. So Dick would make these full-size sketches of a grill and we'd stick it on the model and it looks real. You know, it's got all the shading and the chrome has the shading. When that's finished, you come in and if you have chrome on the car, you take regular tin foil and you put it right on the clay and you squeegee that on and smooth it out. When it's finished, it looks just like the vehicle that you want it to be. If you walk away from it, 50 feet, you can't tell it from a real car.
Another high point in Harvester styling came with the addition of Detroit stylist Ted Ornis in the 1950s.
Ted had done a number of things, including some contract jobs for International, and he was just about ready to give up the whole business. Things were going down the tubes, and he wasn't having any kind of luck at all, and he got a call from International that, of all things, they had decided to have an internal design staff and wanted him to run it.
He brought a design philosophy. There was no philosophy as far as I can tell. It was engineers being stylists, and sometimes with more success than other times, but he brought it in as a real professional discipline, and our trucks became stylish for maybe the first time.
The way I see Ted Ornis, he was the captain of the ship. Okay, he gave the orders, he delegated, he would direct the way certain projects were going. Most often, Ted Ornis would be given an edict from higher up to develop a certain product as the first scout.
Ted Ornis is credited with the styling for one of the most significant International Harvester product lines of the 20th century, the Scout. A lightweight, nimble, four-wheel drive, all-purpose vehicle came about from desire to compete against one of the most famous names in off-road vehicles, Jeep.
The recreational vehicle market was growing exponentially by the late 50s. The origins of the Scout start with a trip that a bunch of executives made out west. They saw way too many Jeeps doing things that they thought International Harvester vehicles could do. And the original concept was to add a compact light truck to their light truck line. So their original charge was to build a light truck, but doing it on the cheap. They said, we don't want any complex angles. We want it square and boxy so that the tooling is minimal. So he struggled with that. And the way Ted Ornis reported it, he said everything came out looking like a Jeep. So he was kind of boxed in with that body shape and the low-cost development part of it. And along the way, somebody discovered a material called Royalite. And Royalite is a thermoplastic. It's kind of along the same lines as PVC. You could make Royalite in a mold. You could make it whatever shape you wanted quite easily. Once you had the mold developed, there was a lot of advantages to it, and on the surface it looked like it was going to be really cheap. That's where the legendary Ted Ornis kitchen table design comes from. About the time they had decided to investigate Royalite, Ted Ornis knew he was free from having to use a boxy vehicle to something that actually had a little bit of style to it. So that vehicle that he drew in that kitchen table drawing one evening after work, he showed that around to the executives and got the first kind of smiles and positive feedback that he had gotten from the project so far. Well, there was a mass feigning spell, I think, at International Harvester when they got the bids back to make Royalite bodies, and it was a lot more expensive than they'd been led to believe in the beginning. So they realized it was just as costly to build that as it would be just to go through the normal steel body development.
It was 1958. The design for the new all-purpose vehicle finally had the green light. To accommodate the production of the new model line, International Harvester purchased a 500,000 square foot factory from U.S. Rubber Corporation. The former World War II production facility had been used by Studebaker for making engine parts for the B-17 Flying Fortress and was located very near to the Fort Wayne Works. One side of the factory would house an assembly line for heavy-duty cab-over trucks, and the remaining floor space would be used to produce the new Scouts. Ornis had started the styling process for Scout in 1958, and the Fort Wayne Works engineers were able to make the Scout factory ready in only 2 years. The first Scout rolled off the assembly line on December 1st, 1960.
Starts with styling. People tend to forget, the mechanical part of things because, Ted Ornis made what it looks like, but the engineering department is what built the bones of it.
International was ready to make a name for itself with this new class of vehicle, but they first needed a name for their new product. However, the management team ran into a bit of a snag when they picked the name they wanted.
The name Scout originated within the company. They liked that name and somebody thought of it in-house. Well, much to their chagrin, they discovered that it had already been trademarked. So they had to negotiate with a fellow named Nodwell in Canada to buy the trademark from him. Nodwell built a vehicle which was like a snowcat.
The International Scout would be no stranger to snow itself, with an optional snowplow attachment being a popular add-on. Vehicles bearing the Scout name arrived at International Harvester dealers as early as 1961. The public received the new vehicles with open arms. Orders quickly outpaced production, despite building over 28,000 in 1961.
I think they were only expecting to build 2,000 or 3,000.
Scouts were back ordered pretty much for the first year. They were always behind that first year, orders versus production.
Scout was an unexpected phenomena to International.
One factor that led to the success of the Scout was its widespread appeal. Due to the variety of uses and multiple configurations, it was able to span the gap between work utility and sport utility vehicle. Farmers and businesses found it well suited as a rugged work vehicle, but it could also be used for camping, fishing, and exploring. What's more, it could be used as an everyday personal vehicle as well.
It's a bunch of things. It's an off-road vehicle, it's a suburban grocery getter, it's a race truck. It's so many different things. It's so flexible. Even on our first brochure for the Scout, we show like 5 different configurations. It's just an incredibly distinctive product that's known all over the world.
Very iconic, probably as recognizable as anything by the general public.
I tell people who I work for, I say Navistar, and nobody knows who Navistar is. I say, oh, it's the old International Harvester Company. And right away, they know 2 names. They know Farmall tractors, and they know the Scout. It's incredible, the following.
It became very, very popular, and the warranty was good on it. The biggest problem that it had, reputation, and I'm talking problem, was the rust.
Rust was a problem common to most steel construction vehicles of the era, but the Scout's reputation was far from tarnished. Instead, it was opening doors to new customer bases that International Harvester hadn't tapped into before: recreational users and suburban families.
They were transitioning from a purely commercial vehicle, which was what it was originally intended to be, to a kind of a mass market or a civilian vehicle, if you want to use that term, where people used it maybe as a second car, but certainly as a recreational vehicle. Most people couldn't afford to own a vehicle that would just go playing in the mud or just to go fishing in. They became a second car. So they had to make it comfortable enough and roadworthy enough to be able to do that, along with going four-wheeling.
The accommodations of the first Scouts built in 1961 were indeed Spartan, evoking descriptions like tough, rugged, and bare bones. This first generation was called the Scout 80.
The 80 was for its load capacity, essentially 800 pounds. At the time it came out, it was a few steps ahead of the Jeep in the short wheelbase utility vehicle market. It was more comfortable, more weather tight, it had a little bit more cargo capacity, it was faster, you could drive it down the road better, and they had a little bit more style. They weren't as boxy. It was a short wheelbase vehicle with a 4-cylinder, 152 cubic inch engine that made 86 net horsepower, had a 3-speed manual transmission that was made by Warner Gear, and it had a much, much stronger chassis.
You had a heavy-duty, constructed, welded frame from A.O. Smith. It was a truck frame, no question. Now with that, you sacrifice some ride and suspension. You know, it's a stiff ride. We got our axles from Dana right out there on West State Street. The springs were all leaf springs.
The original Scout was configured to be built in 3 different ways. You could have a roadster. You didn't have doors, you didn't have a top. They had a fold-down windshield. The base configuration, though, for a Scout was what they called a cab top. And cab top was a pickup, basically. It had a removable top. It had a fixed bulkhead behind the seats. You know, a pickup, you have to have some way to divide the passenger compartment from the cargo compartment, right? The third configuration was what they called a travel top, originally just the means to cover the load area. They fooled around with some ideas to put rear seats back there, but they realized that wasn't going to cut it. They need to make a station wagon out of the Scout, because their original picture for the Scout was a light pickup, and they thought that the market was going to buy a lot of 2-wheel drive versions of it. Well, people were ordering 4-wheel drives with the travel top, which was their name for the full-length top. They had to scramble and redesign the body so that it would have what they called a walk-through feature, could be configured as a station wagon or as a pickup. All the tops were removable, so if you bought a cab top, you could easily change it out for whatever.
In 1963, the Fort Wayne Works reached a milestone of producing 1 million trucks over a 40-year time span. In 1964, the Scout reached the 100,000 mark after only 3 full years of production.
I think it exceeded the market for utility vehicles, for commercial utility vehicles. International learned, as most auto manufacturers learn, is the more bling you put on a vehicle, the more of a profit margin there is in it.
The styling department was given the task of making the Scout more upscale by revamping the interiors with posh features and adding a bit of bling to the external appearance.
63, there was a lot of big changes in the Scout 80 that moved it up the comfort food chain. And then in 1964, they took a giant leap with the Red Carpet series Scouts. That was the first time the Scout had been offered with anything close to comfort and style. Nice interior with carpets, better sound deadening, an actual headliner on the roof, a little bit of style, a little bit of chrome, a little bit of bling, tires that weren't quite so noisy as the off-road tires that most Scouts had.
Scout started, just to give you an example, with external door hinges on the 80, and then we brought those inside, and that's a small example, but we did tons of those kinds of changes to make it into a family vehicle.
When they were coming up with these special editions, which they internally called doll-ups, you doll something up, the Champagne was really going to be the first one, and the Red Carpet was going to come second. But somebody decided that the Red Carpet was better to celebrate the 100,000th Scout, which was built in the summer of 1964. They wanted to market it as a second car. Dad or mom could drive them around, go to the store in them, drive it back and forth to work. They were comfortable enough to use every day. They could go down the road reasonably comfortably, keep up with traffic, so on and so forth, so they could be used as a second car. And then, if you needed to haul something, or if you wanted to go skiing, you could get up to the slopes. If you wanted to go fishing, you could go down that dirt road and find your fishing hole. If you wanted to just go four-wheeling and get the tires all muddy and climb to the top of a mountain, you could do that too. So it was kind of a do-anything vehicle. Once the vehicle became more civilized, women were more willing to drive them. Another big paradigm shift came when they offered power steering and automatic transmissions in the Scout, and that lived up to the second car advertising. A Champagne or a Red Carpet, there's no reason why you couldn't go off-roading. They were just as capable as a bare bones edition. That's only 10% of the time. The rest of the time, they're driving it around town, right? And so that's where the comfort features come in, because who wants to suffer day to day?
When the Scout first came out, there wasn't anything like it on the market, and was bought up by a lot of women, had their say on owning a Scout. I sold Scouts to women too that thoroughly enjoyed them, and that's what they wanted.
While the vehicle certainly appealed to the general public, it wasn't always sold at a place the average person would go to shop for a family car.
International Harvester sold most of their stuff out of either truck dealers or farm equipment dealers. You had to go to a farm equipment dealer to look at a Scout. You had to go to a truck dealer to look at a Scout.
It's a different marketplace. They're not the same mindset when you go to buy a large truck compared to a consumer sports utility. You have different trade-ins you have to worry about, the customer's needs and wants. You've got more women involved in those buying decisions, and how they get treated is definitely an asset to your sale or a detriment to your sale, depending on how you do that.
That would really, really hinder them the whole way through the production of the Scout.
They certainly would have done better with more automotive-oriented businesses.
Even though the customer had to go the extra mile to find a Scout dealer, the demand for the Scout remained strong. International Harvester responded to the shift in buyer demographics by introducing the new and improved Scout 800 to the masses in 1966.
They needed to tame the Scout down, turn it into less of a commercial vehicle and more of a mass market or consumer vehicle. That's primarily what they addressed with the 800, was making it more comfortable, more quiet, more stylish, go down the road better, faster. The red carpet and the champagne editions were kind of the transition vehicles to that, and it just culminated in the Scout 800.
When they went to the Scout 800, they hired tons of us college kids to go in there and ramp up production from, it was either 40 or 60 a day to 120.
1966 was a record-breaking year for the International Harvester Truck Division, producing over 175,000 trucks in the USA. The ever-increasing Scout production helped to push the Fort Wayne Works to a new record with 65,999 total vehicles. International Harvester updated its operations in Springfield, Ohio, with the opening of a brand new factory with more capacity to produce pickups, travel-alls, and medium-duty trucks. 1966 also brought some heavyweight competition into the ring against the Scout. The Ford Motor Company rolled out their new SUV, the Bronco.
The Bronco immediately took a big chunk of their market share. I mean, they were doing okay. Prior to that, they were selling really well against the Jeep. But then the Bronco came along, and of course, Ford Motor Company, they could build more vehicles in a day than International could build in a year. And that kind of changed the direction of the Scout 800. And as the 800 transitioned into the 800A, they offered things like automatic transmission. They added a 6-cylinder to the lineup and certain things like that that enabled them to keep market parity with the Bronco, who was killing them the most at the time.
Ford upped the ante by offering a more powerful V8 engine with the Bronco.
They had to do a lot of re-engineering of the Scout 800 to drop a V8 in. It seems simple to people that do engine swaps and things like that, but when you have to stand behind warranty and safety and everything else, you have to do it a little bit more diligently than a guy in his garage, you know, sticking a Chevy V8 in his Scout, right? That slowed the Scout 2 down. Originally, the Scout 2 or the X-Scout was going to debut in 1968-ish.
The Fort Wayne Works engineers were working diligently to modify the Scout 800. Meanwhile, Chevrolet jumped into the SUV market with the Blazer in 1969. Once again, this put pressure on International Harvester to step up its game to stay in the competition. The answer was the Scout 2, introduced in 1971.
The 800 line was lagging behind the rest of the competition, and the Scout 2 put it right on an even keel with everything out there. Not only did they have a larger, more stylish body that had a lot more room in it, it was easier to get in and out of, it was much quieter, it was much safer, it was much more capable of being a second car than the previous generation. Plus, they had powertrain parity with everybody. The Blazer had the biggest engine available, which was a 350 cubic inch V8. Well, International put their medium duty 345 V8 into the Scout as the top option. That gave them perfect parity with the Blazer as far as being able to tow more, being able to haul more, go faster. Plus, they introduced a better automatic transmission and power steering and air conditioning. They'd never had air conditioning in the Scout prior to the Scout 2. They didn't have power steering in the Scout prior to the Scout 2. They came up with some really stylish interiors.
The introduction of new models provided creative opportunities for stylists like Dick Hatch.
There was an applique for the Scout 2. I came up with the idea of why not make part of it translucent so you can see the paint color through it, and effectively you've got a three-tone. You've got the base color, you've got the solid black or the solid white, and then you've got the part that is sort of whatever the base color is, muted or modified by black or white. But no one had ever done it before. The reason I think people hate me for it is you can't replicate it once the car is old.
The improvements introduced in the Scout II gave the SUV an even broader appeal. Collectors like Sam Elliott still seek out, restore, and drive this iconic vehicle more than 50 years after its introduction.
The Scout II, disc brakes and power steering, it was so much easier to drive and just a better truck. It was more of a car truck. There was no going back. I mean, I had a whole bunch of those early ones, but after you have a Scout II, it's hard to go back to a regular old Scout.
It was a big jump ahead for them, and it put them on equal footing with basically everybody building SUVs at that moment in time.
It wasn't long before the competition on the sales floors spilled over onto the dirt roads of the desert. Four-wheel drive enthusiasts wanted to see how their vehicles stacked up against their rivals. That spirit of competition spawned one of the most extreme endurance races known to man.
It's an intense thing. If you're running the Baja 1000, it's a week of grueling punishment.
Out west, when they had Baja, that was blood. They were after money.
The first of these desert racing warriors to drive a Scout in the Baja 1000 and win was Jimmy Jones in 1972. A Scout competing and winning in the Baja 1000 got the attention of some influential people in the International corporate office.
The motor truck division, they were pretty stodgy in their attitudes at that time, so they didn't really necessarily see the advertising benefits of being involved in racing. But there were people like a guy named Dick Backham and Larry Ehlers and some others at International Harvester, and then Ted Ornis got on board, and he was probably the heaviest hitter of the bunch to get some attention on a racing program. If Ted Ornis was behind it, everybody else looked seriously at the idea. They decided to sponsor originally 3 race teams, and then it quickly spread to 4 that were going to be fully sponsored by International Harvester and do desert racing. The marketing benefits that they gained from the race program was in the millions.
The victories in the racing world led Ted Ornis to pursue developing a Scout with a style centered around the competitive off-road experience. The SS2 would be released in 1977 thanks to a clever internal marketing campaign.
They developed a clay model of the SS2, and they set up a shot where they had smoke going and signs in the background like the SS2 had just won a race. Ted Ornis was in a Nomex suit with a helmet under his arm. There was trophies around and everything else. So they call that the Walter Mitty Ornis shot. And that shot made the rounds of International, and that helped kind of push the SS2 into approval. That was basically a stripped down Scout with no top and no doors and with door inserts. It was lightened up. It came only with a soft top. It had a roll bar, and it was designed kind of as an off-road vehicle. And that became the poster child for their racing program.
It wasn't just the pros that were having all the fun. Four-wheel racing clubs were popular all across the nation. The Fort Wayne Works guys put together a team to show their Scout pride.
The 4x4 Club came about because a couple of the managers knew that IH could sell surplus material to nonprofit groups. So we formed a club, the Fort Wayne Four-Wheel Drive Club. We bought in fact, it was one of the pre-production mock-ups that was used in development. And they were done with that, bought that, and built it into a racer. And we started racing with that one first, and then a couple others were built over the years after that.
Even in the stock class, they were the ones to beat.
We were still in stock class with the allowed modifications we had, but we'd upgrade so 3 people could drive it in a racing weekend, and we often were competitive in every class.
I got to meet some of the guys that did it, and it was a hot dog, beer drinking, fun time. And they were competitive because they're racing Jeeps. But these guys were doing it for fun, just to kick dirt in that guy's face.
The Scout was well suited for the racing environment because we could do quite well compared to most other people. I mean, having a couple of engineers involved, we had a real well-running engine, and we were competitive with most of the rest of the Jeeps and Broncos and everything else.
The Scout stepped into the world spotlight in 1976 when International supplied the U.S. Olympic ski team with their official vehicles for the Winter Olympics in Innsbruck, Austria. This was also the year for the bicentennial of the United States.
It was a good opportunity to kind of show the American flag and get International involved in the Olympics. So they developed a bicentennial themed Scout for the Olympic team. And they built 17 of them. They were 76 model years, but they were built in 75.
This also inspired 3 other special models for the consumer market: the Spirit of 76, Patriot, and the Snowstar. The Patriot and Snowstar were offered in 2 new models for that year, the Scout II Traveler and the Terra, both of which had a wheelbase that was 18 inches longer than the standard Scout II.
They were going to lengthen the wheelbase to 118 inches, and that just offered a lot more room, both cargo capacity and passenger room, in an SUV-type vehicle, and that vehicle became the Traveler. But it also offered them the opportunity to build a light pickup, which was called the Terra.
In 1975, the U.S. was facing a recession that was coupled with fuel shortages caused by an OPEC oil embargo. Gas prices skyrocketed, and Americans were looking for more fuel-efficient vehicles. This contributed to Harvester's decision to discontinue its light line of gas-guzzling Travelalls and pickup trucks being made in Springfield. Some of the medium-duty truck production was transferred away from Fort Wayne to take advantage of the excess capacity in the newer Ohio factory. Although International Harvester was a public corporation, its top management seemed more like a family business run by successive generations of McCormicks through most of the 20th century. In 1977, CEO Brooks McCormick, the great-grandnephew of Cyrus McCormick, decided the company needed fresh-thinking leadership to propel the company forward.
In 1977, Harvester hired Archie McCardle away from Xerox to come to Chicago and to run the company.
Brooks McCormick recognized big changes had to be made. I don't think he had the heart to do them, which is why he resigned and they brought in Archie McCardle, given the instructions to make some changes.
He was paid the sum of $460,000 a year and given a $1.5 million signing bonus. This was unheard of money back then and made him among the few highest paid public company executives in the United States. This fact was not lost on the rank and file and the UAW when contract time came around 2 years later.
McCardle started by having International Harvester department heads identify ways to make cost-saving changes to their budgets. This resulted in an increase in corporate profitability in 1979. Employment at Fort Wayne is at a record high 10,500. The stage was set for a battle when McCardle turned his cost-cutting scissors to one of the company's largest expenditures, the labor contract with the UAW.
They'd always had a tenuous relationship with the company. On August 9th of 1979, Archie McCardle and Hank Crandall, his second in command at the time, met with Pat Greathouse from the UAW to start working on the new contract.
I think the board had full knowledge of what they were going to demand. You know, they wanted to get some concessions from the union. The union wasn't going to do it, so the two heads butted.
It didn't take long for negotiations to break down. In fact, they hardly got started when a week later, on August 12th, it was announced that they'd had the best quarter that they'd had in years and the highest profit they'd had in years, and here they were demanding quite a number of concessions from the workers, and it just didn't fit together.
He had some justification in wanting to negotiate better terms with the UAW, and that was probably a good idea as far as, you know, saving the company or at least bleeding a little less red ink. but his timing was horrible. It was a game of chicken and neither side blinked.
Negotiations between labor and management historically have involved some level of brinkmanship. Eventually, demands and differences are mediated down to an agreement consisting of compromises from both sides. This time, however, Harvester and the UAW were so far apart on their demands that both sides ended up walking away from the bargaining table.
We met 2 full days, Tuesday and Wednesday, and the company failed to resolve any of the local issues or a single grievance. The company left Thursday morning stating there would be no more meetings.
The news of a possible strike went out Thursday afternoon to Fort Wayne Harvester workers from UAW Local 57. A walkout would idle 8,000 of the 10,000 workers here. The remaining 2,000 are non-union personnel, and they would be expected to report to work.
The UAW was in no mood to bend to the demands of Archie McArdle and Company. On November 1st of 1979, they went out on strike.
They walked out at noon.
Minutes after workers filed out of the Harvester plant, picket signs were up.
Of course, all these guys got out, dropped their lunch boxes out there, and started a picket line right there in front of that main gate between the tower and the branch building. Well, unbelievably, there was an executive there on so-called Mahogany Row, and he come up to me, Jim, you got all this union relations background, you got more than anybody, go out down there and break up that line. I said, they have a legal right to picket. There's nothing wrong with it. They're totally legal. That spoke volumes in terms of people that didn't know how to react to a picket, to a strike, or know the rights and the wrongs.
The specific details of a contract negotiation were always kept private until it could be presented to the entire UAW membership for ratification. Some issues were known, but others could only be speculated on.
According to Dick Gaskell, Vice President of UAW Local 57 here, he says there are 2 issues in this strike, seniority and mandatory overtime.
Wanted some overtime changes in terms of getting the qualified people to work the overtime, not just because you're the senior guy or you're the low-hour guy to work, okay? To work overtime, you're going to be schooled and know how to do the job. You know, you might have got that job through seniority, but you're not going to have us paying time and a half until you know how to do it. But the union's out there, and they knew of a couple of issues, let's say 3 issues. They didn't know the top 10 issues. They didn't know the other 47 issues. So they're out there blind wondering why they're on strike. Management, I'm talking foreman all the way to the top, did not know why we let them go on strike. Management did not know what the company was after.
When contract negotiations stalled, UAW members directed their anger toward one person, Archie McArdle. That sentiment still lingers more than 45 years after the strike.
What do you think was the reason for the breakdown in negotiations?
Well, I think it was the main fault was Archie McArdle.
He wanted to break the union.
He was like a hatchet man.
The board said they wanted to take care of the UAW, get rid of them.
My thoughts, he was a downfall of a lot, but the economy and everything else also entered into that also.
During 1980, we were having the recession, which many economists felt was the worst recession since after World War II. Interest rates were 17%, unemployment was 10.9%, inflation was 14%, and the economy was in a free fall. It was no time to be manufacturing capital equipment that you expected to sell.
We may have been just as well off not building anything for that 6 months as continuing production and having it setting in inventory because nothing was selling anyway.
They took out massive bank loans to keep the cash flow going, and it was the beginning of the end for the company.
As Harvester braced itself to weather the economic storm, UAW workers in Fort Wayne piled up firewood, hoping to keep warm in the long winter months during the strike, well aware they too were in the same economic storm without their main source of income.
If you hadn't prepared for it, you were going to be in trouble financially.
At the Local 57 Union Hall, members were now signing up for picket duty.
Sign it right here and bring that card back when you walk picket and to collect your benefit check.
We had to walk the picket line. They give us certain days, we had to come up and do it. It was cold, wintry, and just kept warm.
It's not a good feeling because you don't know when you're going back.
I was single at the time, and I had a daughter, and then I had little part-time jobs that I worked also during the time that we were on strike. So that sustained me, and I had my family that was very supportive, so I made it through.
The only one got hurt was the company, because the union, they stood together and fought them hard, for what they believed in.
We wouldn't break.
They would be on strike for 172 days, just shy of a little over 6 months.
I was glad when it was over.
The strike ended on April 20, 1980, after UAW members ratified the new contract. The strike had depleted the savings of many workers, and the company had sunken deeper into debt. Over the next 6 years, International Harvester would post consecutive annual losses totaling $3.4 billion.
It was one of the longest strikes in the history of industry in the United States, and irreparably damaged International Harvester.
The big thing was it brought to light the shortage of capital.
The strike ended because International Harvester was out of money. I don't care what anybody else tells you, we were out of money, we needed to go back to work. And that interest rate was still locked in there.
A lot of people want to say it was Archie's fault. I think he was brought in to try to save a sinking ship and couldn't quite do it.
That sinking feeling persisted into the next decade. By 1980, International Harvester was besieged with difficulties on every side. The company was still limping from the effects of the prolonged strike. The U.S. economy was in a recession, and sagging sales of the Scout line, due to these external factors, were making it look more like a liability than an asset to the top brass in Chicago.
The gas crunch had really hurt. That hurt the entire auto industry, cut into their profits because they had to adapt to fuel economy standards, they had to adapt to emission standards. They didn't renew the emission certification for the Scout engines.
Emissions testing is so expensive because engine testing and development is so expensive. And so if you have to come out with a new engine to meet the regulation, the emissions regulation, it's expensive. And you need to have a lot of volume to spread that expense.
We didn't have the volume of engines to amortize the cost of all the development work for that. We went on for a few years, but again, it got to the practical realization that if you're not building thousands of them a day, only hundreds a day, it gets very difficult to sustain that continuing compliance cost.
By the spring of 1980, double-digit inflation had caused the Federal Reserve to raise interest rates to 17.5%. Severely tightening credit. Harvester was drowning in debt and desperately in need of cash. Perhaps, if they could get someone to buy the Scout line instead of ending production, it would be a win-win. They needed a hero to ride in on a white horse and save the day.
Ed Russell was an entrepreneur. He came from the Midwest. There's nothing more Texas than a Midwesterner that transplants himself to Texas because he had the big cowboy hats, the boots, the shirts, the whole bit.
Russell had built a successful company called Good Times in Arlington, Texas, specializing in conversion van customization, which was very popular at the time. Certain individuals in the International Harvester Organization saw the potential to give the Scout the same treatment.
Some of his marketing people were contacted by the Southwestern sales division of International to build some special models for that market. And so they worked a deal and they did some special models that are revered today. They're very rare. The deal was reached where he would set up a facility in Fort Wayne to do this upfitting work. And they changed the name of the company to CVI, or Custom Vehicles Incorporated. And they built all these upfitted Scouts. But while the strike was going on, I don't know exactly what was happening behind the scenes, but they decided to offer the Scout division up for sale, that maybe somebody would buy it. And I don't know whether they had Ed Russell in mind from the get-go, or he was just the first person to stand up and say, you know, I'm interested. So he put together a consortium of people from the Fort Wayne area, and allegedly Steyr Pooch in Austria was going to be involved in it, and they were going to buy the Scout name, they were going to lease the factory.
Russell was relying, in part, on assistance from county and city officials to provide public funds to help supplement the deal and keep the Scout plant in Fort Wayne operating.
He had made the statement, if I remember correctly, that it was going to be most probably going to be a non-union shop.
Russell says he's not opposed to unions, but admits the union situation at the Scout plant will influence his decision.
We sure have to take in the union situation into consideration in anything we do up here. No question about that.
And I can remember the UAW workers coming to City Council, and they lined the room, all dressed in powder blue T-shirts with UAW across it, and it was kind of an intimidation.
On October 8th, International Harvester announced they were terminating their agreement with the Texas investor due to a failure of certifying financing, and as a result, it would cease production of the Scout line on October 21st. Workers had only a couple of weeks before their jobs would end.
Scout was definitely more of a surprise.
We did have 2 generations of Scouts in the works when it was pulled.
There were plans of moving right ahead with developing the Scout line, moving it in an upscale direction and all that. And there were models and prototypes of 81s and clay models for a new model in 84 or so.
And then by 87, there was going to be the all-new combined Scout, light line, all that stuff.
So they had all these little special editions and special vehicles planned to build, and some of them didn't come to fruition because of the failure of the Scout division.
I would never say that we fully understood it, especially as a younger person.
It was just moving ahead, and boom, the end.
Several factors appear to have been involved in the decision, but perhaps the biggest was International Harvester's corporate financial problems.
Well, the company was out of money. The projects we had in spring of 1980 were ranked, and the most profitable ones were chosen. There was enough money to do the first 2 projects, and the Scout came in number 3.
I don't think the company wanted to save Scout. I don't think International Harvester really wanted. Now, there were elements within the Scout division that certainly wanted to save Scout, and I think they had a pretty good business plan to save Scout, and I think that business plan would have worked. But I think International Harvester made up their minds pretty early on that they wanted to end the Scout.
The decision culminated with the final Scout rolling off the factory floor on October 21st, 1980.
There was no cheering or hooting and hollering. Everybody their chin was down, and there was no tears, but it was an emotional day.
It was a very, very sad day. It just bring tears to your eyes. I mean, not just the pride, but the people losing their jobs.
I think the number was 464, if I recall correctly, that lost their jobs as a direct result of the Scout going away.
When I got 5 years in, I figured I had a job for life, but the economy and the way things went and the company.
When all was said and done, 532,674 Scouts had been produced in Fort Wayne from 1960 through 1980. The story came full circle in 2023 at a Harvester homecoming event in Fort Wayne when the freshly restored first Scout produced was displayed side by side with the last Scout to roll off the assembly line.
It was an official last Scout. Actually, by VIN, it wasn't the last VIN issued, but it was the last one to roll off the line.
The Scout remains a highly collectible vehicle all over the world, even today, more than 40 years after the last one was made. Scout enthusiasts gather at a variety of events, like this one in Fort Wayne, to display their restored vehicles, swap stories, and celebrate the Scout.
And a lot of it is the people that own them. That I put on a show and go to shows across the country and talk to the owners, and it's kind of a family.
A lot of people know me by that truck.
To me, it's like the Rolls-Royce of SUVs. They might not be all fancy and smooth riding, but they're built rugged to take the punishment.
I love the vehicle.
I started collecting Scouts in the early 70s. The first one was a 61, and it wasn't fast, but it was a lot of fun.
When the roads were bad, you get down the road with it in four-wheel drive.
You can get anywhere you want in bad weather, and that Scout has saved our lives a couple times.
In the winter, we'd pull the sled behind it. I would take it in the mud and drive. I wouldn't beat on it. It was too hard to earn another one. And I was into more preserving right from the beginning.
I guess I'm on the preservation side, although I'm not one that has to keep everything bone stock.
In 1978, I ordered a brand new Scout, and my name was on the windshield when it went down the line.
I had 2 Scouts of my own. The first one in 72, I walked the line with it while it was built.
I've owned 3 Scouts. Bought a used Aristocrat soon after I started here. And then I had 2 Scout 2s, one of which I still have.
How many do I have?
How many have you owned over the whole?
Oh my gosh. I thought I counted 27 or 8.
Part of the appeal is the simplicity of the engine and mechanical components of the Scout.
They were a very simple vehicle to work on. There was not anything too high-tech on them. It was all mechanical gear trains. Electronics were very simple. Wiring was very simple. And that was one of the things that made them very reliable.
Very dependable. That was before everybody worried about the gas mileage and everything.
The clubs in the Scout world have work weekends. They'll go to one guy's house and work on his Scout. Everybody throws in. Do Corvette people do that?
Another thing that makes the Scout so collectible is the relatively small number of units produced.
They're rare. You only built 550,000 of those. So for example, a 69 Camaro is something I used to be into. Well, they built 500,000 of those in 1 year. So there aren't that many Scouts out there. And there's less out there than there was in the beginning.
They're different, and that's what people like about them. They're very different. Beyond that, that core group that just loves them because they're Scouts. The passion I've seen are for the special models. They built a lot of special models, and they were relatively low production.
It brings me back to a younger George Kirkham, a little bit of a young, impressionable salesman, and it's a history lesson. Driving them every day, every time I get in one, it's a history lesson. Yes, they're not as refined as your modern day Suburban or whatever that I drive, but that's the way things were back then.
Terminating the Scout line in 1980 barely moved the needle in terms of bringing Harvester back towards profitability. Even though its truck sales worldwide were a hefty $3.3 billion, the truck division barely managed to break even with expenses. International's flagship agricultural equipment group reported a $30 million loss, and the struggling construction equipment business posted a $23 million loss.
We continued to make more and more sales, and we continued to make less and less profit. Our sales were good, and our profits were terrible.
In December of 1981, Archie McCardle and the board were able to work out a deal with the company's nearly 200 creditors to restructure its crushing $4.2 billion of debt. This refinancing deal was seen as a temporary reprieve to keep the industrial giant from filing for bankruptcy. Back at the Fort Wayne Works, only 5,000 employees remained on the job, compared to the 10,500 workers employed before the strike. The city of Fort Wayne was suffering, with a jobless rate of 11%. 1982 would also be Archie McCardle's second contract negotiations with the UAW. His argument for $100 million in concessions from the union seemed stronger than ever against the grim economic backdrop. At this point, it was looking like the future of the entire company was in doubt. Perhaps it was this realization that their very livelihoods were at stake that brought the UAW back to the bargaining table. The average union employee made $12.35 an hour compared to a minimum wage of $3.35 at that time. A deepening recession was keeping unemployment levels in double digits. It was no time to be on strike, or much worse, looking for work.
Times were tough. You couldn't get a job at Ford Motor Company, Chrysler, or GM. Everybody was laid off.
McCardle and Harvester had the upper hand this time. On May 2, 1982, UAW members ratified a new 29-month contract that included an astounding $200 million in contract concessions. The next day, it was announced that Archie McCardle and International Harvester were parting ways. Louis Mink replaced him as chairman of the board, and Don Lennox became the new president and chief operating officer. Back in March, Harvester had sent telegrams to the government leaderships in both Fort Wayne and Springfield, asking the cities to put together aid packages to help keep the manufacturing facilities in their towns open.
I'm Carl Bandmer. I was the Economic Development Director under Mayor Win Moses. When Harvester announced that it was liable to leave, that really elevated the concern.
The mayor's office held meetings with the local Harvester executives to assess what they could do to retain Fort Wayne's largest employer.
Clearly, Harvester's main needs are cold cash, that there's very little in the way of deferred obligations or guaranteed loans that are going to be of significant benefit to them.
City, county, and state officials went to Chicago this morning to talk with officials of International Harvester about a financial assistance proposal to keep this plant afloat.
When the government delegation returned from their meeting with the Harvester executives, a press conference was held outside of the factory to reveal details of the $20 million incentive package. It contained a $9.2 million loan guarantee program made up of a mixture of state, city, and county funds. An additional $10 million in cash would be provided to Harvester through a sale and leaseback of their parts distribution center.
In return for this effort, Harvester would agree to remain in Fort Wayne so long as the lease exists.
That potential 10-year lease and other pending offers from the community had local leaders feeling optimistic. All seemed to be going well until International Harvester made a bombshell announcement on July 29, 1982. The company would be consolidating its truck manufacturing facilities from 3 factories in North America to just 2. The 3 factories involved were Chatham, Ontario, Springfield, Ohio, and Fort Wayne, Indiana. It soon became apparent that the Canadian facility would remain open. This meant either Springfield or Fort Wayne would have to close. Fort Wayne was now in a fight to keep their crown as heavy-duty truck capital of the world.
I truly believe they have not made up their mind. Mr. Dean Stanley, who's head of our engineering group, talked to Mr. Mink, and he point blank asked him, "Are you going to close Fort Wayne?" And his response was, "It's an option."
That kind of set this whole competition in motion. We knew that we were going to have to step up and figure out how we were going to influence Harvester's decision.
The financial assistance we'll offer International Harvester will not necessarily be the decisive factor, but it will certainly be an important factor in the company's decision. Whatever the case is, we must act quickly.
Fort Wayne Mayor Win Moses spearheaded the effort to convince those in state and county government and the local business community that giving public assistance to a private company was in everyone's best interest.
Given the number of Harvester employees here, if they were out of a job, that means they weren't going to be able to shop in your stores. Chances they weren't going to be able to make their mortgage payment. There was going to be a huge impact beyond just the fact that Harvester might shut down. So you need to get on board here and work with us to try to save Harvester and keep them here in the city.
The Fort Wayne community responded to the cause by making pleas to state officials, holding rallies downtown, and filling sandbags with letters to show their support for keeping Harvester jobs in the city.
The community had pulled itself together back in the 20s to bring Harvester here, and they are now replaying that effort to keep Harvester here.
Community and state leaders in Springfield, Ohio were working just as hard to convince Harvester to stay in their community.
Everybody was worried. They didn't want this plant to close. And everybody pulled for Springfield.
The two communities, locked in a contest for survival, caught the attention of struggling Americans everywhere.
This competition got national attention. It was front page on the New York Times, the Wall Street Journal.
This morning, Harvester employees in Fort Wayne, Indiana went to work wondering whether theirs will be that one. In the past 2 years, these men who make trucks have watched their assembly line shrink from 10,000 to 4,000 workers. Harvester used to be the #1 employer in Fort Wayne. This big old building used to be a place you could rely on.
You used to come in and figure, hey, you're going to stay here and probably get your time in. If you live to be 65, you could retire. But now you just come in and figure maybe you'll get through the day. Maybe you'll get sent home at noon.
Not only Harvester employees are worried these days, because if the company folds, so may a lot of other businesses here.
Surely it won't. Surely it won't. But every time you hear more, it was not good.
We'd just like to know whether we got a job or whether we don't. It'd be terrible if we don't have, but the dread of not knowing is even worse than knowing.
I can't say to them that if we raise $30 million, we're certain of being able to save Harvester or to bring the Springfield plants over here. We don't know for sure.
You really didn't know where corporate was. They said they didn't have a preference. It was just going to be who's going to put together the best package.
Offers were presented to the top management at International corporate headquarters behind closed doors in Chicago. Governor Robert Orr and Lieutenant Governor John Mutz represented the Indiana state government.
We wanted to make it very clear to Harvester management that our deal is complete, it's ready to close, it's a program that in fact can produce the cash that the company needs badly at this time.
Fort Wayne Mayor Win Moses was often accompanied by Carl Bandemer, City Attorney Bruce Boxberger, and number-crunching assistant Mark Angel.
Harvester has already indicated to the bankers that they are going to close one of the truck plants and obtain a savings on an annual basis that approximates $55 million per year. The bankers would be very unlikely to approve the debt restructuring, which is far more important to Harvester than our aid packages, if one of the plants weren't closed.
The bankers were heavily involved at that point. They were helping us save the company, and I understand they toured both Springfield and Fort Wayne.
Springfield plant was much newer than the Fort Wayne facility, so that was probably a strike against us. On the other hand, it was our understanding that the productivity in Fort Wayne was much better than the productivity in Springfield, so that was to our advantage.
Both cities were constantly working to meet or exceed what the other was offering Harvester in a high-stakes game of one-upmanship.
We were always trying to figure out exactly what the other party was trying to do so we could, hopefully match them or trump them. Kathy Moses was the deputy director of the Department of Economic Development, part of the group that was working on Harvester. We found out that Springfield was going to have a news conference where they were going to announce the outline of what their offer was going to be. They went to the news conference, and after the news conference was over, they noticed that the notes that the presenter was using had been left on the podium. They went over and were able to get the outline of what the package was going to be, and brought it back to us.
The nearly non-stop effort to bolster Indiana's Harvester aid package continues here at City Hall, and with today's news that Ohio's $30 million of aid is set to go, the pressure is mounting.
I think we're on borrowed time right now, as soon as Ohio's package was completed this morning, and that the state will have to finalize their proposal very quickly here.
The state's addition to the incentive package will be about $4 million. Additionally, Fort Wayne's 5 banks have added approximately $8 million, bringing the Indiana total to about $32 million. The Ohio package stands at $30 million.
Part of the plan was basically a lease back. We would buy the plant, which would give them the cash, and then they would lease it back. Ohio came up with the same deal.
While deals were being made in Chicago between government officials and Harvester executives, a local civic organization was secretly working on a plan of their own. Fort Wayne Future decided to go directly to Harvester employees, asking them to voluntarily defer 15% of their pay to give Harvester a cash incentive to stay in the city.
Harvester employees would agree individually to defer a portion of their income for at least a period of 3 years. Harvester would agree then to pay back that money to them after they reach retirement or after a period of 3 years, whichever the employee selects. It would only go into effect and only affect the paychecks if Harvester announced that its plant would stay here in the Fort Wayne area.
The plan was controversial from the start. The organization had not briefed Mayor Moses, nor had it consulted with the union leadership before the details of the plan were announced.
What Fort Wayne Future did was definitely something to try to keep the plant here and save some of the jobs of some of our members and the employees at Harvester. However, it's my opinion also that the way they did it was the thing that was wrong.
Today I'm pleased to announce that International Harvester employees have agreed to wage and salary deferrals totaling over $9 million.
Only time would tell if public and private efforts would be enough to win the day. With summer fading into fall, it seemed optimism was fading in Fort Wayne as well. Local Harvester workers and city officials were originally told the decision would be made in a few weeks. The waiting had now dragged on for nearly 2 months.
Just leave. We don't care anymore. I don't think we can say that. You know, maybe in the mid-'60s when the economy was booming and you could find other employers easily, you could say that. I think we've got to fight as hard as we can and as long as we can to keep what we've got.
The anticipation was palpable as rumors spread that International Harvester may be close to a decision.
Can you say that tomorrow morning, International Harvester will hold a news conference to announce they are moving to Springfield?
No, but I would not be surprised if tomorrow or Monday they would hold such a news conference to announce their decision.
The decision is imminent and the decision will be unfavorable.
They're going to shut down Fort Wayne.
The announcement that everyone anticipated and dreaded came on September 27, 1982.
International Harvester will phase out truck manufacturing in Fort Wayne, Indiana. This decision comes as a harsh blow to thousands of individuals who work for this major employer. I am not surprised. I am disappointed.
Harvester President Lennox said he was impressed with Fort Wayne's multi-million-dollar incentive package, but added money was not the deciding issue.
The overwhelming advantage was the fact that the Springfield plant is a much newer, much more cost-effective plant.
I guess they're doing the best for the company, I don't know.
I think they knew what they had planned all the time.
And that's what I'm a little sad about it, but you have a few sad moments in your life, you know, and you just got to regroup and go back on.
It was heartbreaking, it really was, to see that happen again.
Oh, it broke my heart. That was a big thing to me going to Fort Wayne, seeing all them trucks.
This tale of two cities had ended with a winner and a loser, rejoicing and mourning.
When Springfield was picked, everybody was really happy.
I wish when they'd have voted to keep Fort Wayne.
Some of the longtime employees are hoping Harvester will hang on long enough for them to retire.
In only a matter of months, over 2,000 Harvester truck factory workers would soon join the ranks of the unemployed. This satisfied some that had resented the striking workers during the recession.
We got more local people actually acting like they were happy that International shut down because they were one of the best paying jobs around and stuff like that. And they said, well, now you can find out how the other half lived.
Of course, there are those who say the Harvester pullout is a blessing in disguise. Some say the truck maker is so badly in debt that it will never recover, and Fort Wayne is better off not sinking millions into a dying giant. But regardless of the company's financial future, the outlook is bleak for the financial futures of thousands of Fort Wayne assembly line workers.
And a lot of animosity at Harvester because of the fact that they pulled out of Fort Wayne.
I didn't have hard feelings. I was just concerned about going back to work, but they was in a position they had to close somebody down, or they would have went under.
Brooks McCormick, back when he took office in about '73, he made the statement that if we don't make drastic changes to the company, we'll have nothing to manage in 10 years. None of that necessarily would have saved the Fort Wayne plant because it was getting old, and even if they had the need for the production capacity, eventually there'd probably been a new plant built somewhere.
With the decision finally made, Fort Wayne workers were at least able to start preparing for the next phase of their careers. The good news is that most of them would have several more months of employment to count on.
About 200 factory workers will be laid off in November. Another 800 will be gone by next summer. Harvester representatives in Chicago told News 15 about 1,900 local workers will not be affected by the phase-out. Those non-affected divisions are the axle and transmission plant, the materials management plant, the Worldwide Truck Engineering Center, and the Parts Distribution Center.
The illusion of job security for those departments not affected would soon be shattered as Harvester continued to make more cuts in the months that followed. December 1st, 1982, Harvester announces it will cease making axles and transmissions at its Fort Wayne works. 500 jobs are eliminated. April 20th, 1983, Harvester announces it will close the Fort Wayne Material Management Center. 200 more jobs are eliminated. Then in July of 1983, a 60-year run came to a halt as the last heavy-duty truck made its way down the assembly line at the Fort Wayne Works.
As the 1,527,299th Harvester truck rolled off Fort Wayne's assembly line, the reality of the shutdown hit home. When the line was stopped and their tools set aside, employees knew it would be for the last time.
It's all over.
I'll never forget, it was July the 15th, 1983, and it was a really very sad day when the whistle blew for the last time.
That was very sad. It was very painful. That whistle didn't blow anymore.
This would be the final day at the Fort Wayne Works for 1,700 employees.
We got laid off. That was a big layoff. I was laid off for 4 years.
I got laid off for 6.5 years when the big cutback happened.
900 employees at the Engineering Center and the Parts Distribution Center were not affected by the plant closure and would keep their jobs in Fort Wayne. The 500 remaining factory workers with seniority would be able to stay on to assist with the dismantling and sale of the plant's equipment, but all of those jobs would end by November.
They were taking out all the machinery out, and everything was going out. I mean, you begin to see what really was happening when the floors would begin to look pretty empty.
450 is here, 500 now. 5 bid, $5.5, $600 bid, not 6 bid, not 8.
Once the factory was completely shut down and the last tools and industrial equipment had been auctioned off, it was decision time for some of the workers with the most seniority. Join the thousands of Fort Wayne job seekers in the unemployment lines or transfer to the Springfield, Ohio factory.
In November, they sent a lot of office people to Springfield that was on the list, and so they got to my seniority, and I was transferred to Springfield in November of '82.
Union workers from Fort Wayne had the option to bump a lower seniority worker off the Springfield line. This was crucially important for the ones that were close to retirement age who wanted to lock in their pensions. The drawback was they would either have to relocate or make the 250-mile round-trip commute from Fort Wayne to Springfield.
You had to go by seniority, and so actually there was a waiting list to get in there. Finally, I was able to go back to work in Springfield.
A lot of the guys that had 20 years, they had to go down and finish. They had to go down there.
Many of my friends chose not to go to Springfield, Ohio due to families and roots and, homes and such. And each story's different, and you had to do what worked for you.
Dad took a big cut in his pension because he didn't want to go. He wanted to stay.
I was lucky enough, I got called to Springfield in February of '84. And I'd been laid off since July of '83.
It was an exciting time, for us. It was a time that you realized that it was nice to get back to your job because your seniority would continue and you were able to retire when you got your time. In fact, I spent about 19 years after I left Fort Wayne in the Springfield area.
A lot of them went there mainly to get their 30 years in and then came back. I was there for 20 years and I went back and forth on weekends and lived there during the week.
And the bus ran every day. And there was a gentleman that had the bus, owned it. He was from Angola. So he would drive from Angola to Springfield, Ohio with the bus every day. And so that went on for easy 15 years.
4 buses that held about 40 people each that made the trip to Springfield every day and took workers to work. 2.5-hour drive each direction.
They had to get up like 3 o'clock in the morning and get home at 7 o'clock at night.
I rented a place. It was really too far to drive back and forth. But some drove a car with maybe 2 or 3 passengers. But the only time I would come home would be on a Friday night for Saturday and Sunday.
There was a lot of guys that moved down to Springfield. There was a place in a trailer court in there that it was called Little Fort Wayne. And a lot of the guys bought trailers or rented trailers there. There was like a little city of people from Harvester that used to work there.
My uncle did that for years down there, and he ended up in a trailer, him with 3 or 4 other guys living in a trailer, and then they would come back on the weekend. But Fort Wayne was such a center of their lives. They had kids in high school. They didn't want to leave Fort Wayne.
What did they think of the Fort Wayne people that came here? They called them boat people because they drove over every day, or some of them, there's a mobile home park up the street from the plant. Some of them rented those. Some of them actually had campers out in the lot where they would stay during the week and then drive home.
Which, under the circumstances, it wasn't the best situation because a lot of the people that used to work for Fort Wayne actually had more seniority than a lot of people in Springfield. So there was some situations that you found yourself sometimes, at odds with some of the Springfield people, and then really didn't care too much for us from Fort Wayne.
It was kind of radical at first, and a lot of people in the factory had problems with flat tires and didn't like the people there because they took away their jobs, because of seniority.
Anytime somebody comes in and what they call bump you off the line, they might have seniority from Fort Wayne and they come and take your job and you have to go do a lesser job, which is a union thing.
But eventually, I think it began to the place where after a time, it begins to settle down and things begin to work a lot better.
Met a lot of good friends there in Springfield, and a lot of people became friends. I mean, it worked out good in the end.
I know a lot of people that moved over here from Fort Wayne, and they're just good people, just like Springfield people.
Not everyone had jobs waiting for them in Springfield. Through no fault of their own, they had been severed from the only job they had ever known. The influx of hundreds of area residents asking for assistance overwhelmed local government agencies. The city of Fort Wayne even set up a suicide hotline for former workers trying to cope with the stresses of unemployment. The nonprofit Community Harvest Food Bank was formed to distribute food to those in need. Local families received over 200,000 pounds of food from the organization during its first year.
I see no way that we are going to bring this community back during the entire decade of the 1980s to anything resembling the level it was in the 1970s.
It was a blow to us. I mean, it was a disappointment. It was a disappointment. But I think in many respects it kind of hardened our economic development efforts.
I'm not in any way pessimistic about the city and the future of our community. We've learned something this past year about this city and about our people. No matter what confronts us, we band together. We muster our resources and come out ahead in the long run.
Even though the city was facing a grim economic forecast, Mayor Win Moses and his team acted quickly to preserve the hard-earned economic development funds previously offered to Harvester. Shortly after the announcement that the Fort Wayne Works would close, Carl Bandemer made a request to the city council.
I asked council to keep in place the funds that they had that we had come up with locally for an economic development effort, and I believe that the vote was unanimous.
With the incentive funds secure, Fort Wayne was able to get the attention of a major employer with a huge potential project.
I got a phone call when I was on vacation from the mayor and said I had to be in Indianapolis the next day. So I went down and met in the governor's office. The county was there, other people from the city were there, people from the state, and the people from General Motors were there also.
General Motors was looking for a location to build a new factory for the manufacture of full-size pickup trucks. They presented the state and local representatives with a list of conditions to meet in order to secure the deal for Fort Wayne. This would require an effort very similar to what the city had done to win the International Truck Factory back in the 1920s. On August 31st, 1984, just a little over a year after heavy-duty truck production stopped at Harvester, General Motors announced it was going to build a 2.5 million square foot truck factory in Fort Wayne. The new plant would employ 3,000 workers with an annual payroll of over $100 million flowing into the local economy. 63 years after the first truck was assembled at the new International Harvester factory in Fort Wayne, the first pickup rolled off the assembly line of the new GM plant on December 8, 1986, ensuring that Fort Wayne would remain a truck town for decades to come. Even before the GM plant was announced, there were still men and women working at the International Harvester Engineering Center in Fort Wayne. They had been spared from disaster, much like how one house remains intact after a tornado, while the house next door is completely demolished. The storm was still swirling around International headquarters in Chicago. In November 1984, International Harvester Chairman Don Lennox announced the company had made the monumental decision to sell the agricultural equipment division. The deal with Tenneco, the maker of case equipment, would give Harvester $430 million, allowing it to pay off a good portion of its long-term debt.
When we sold off the ag business finally in '84, we were probably hours away from bankruptcy.
The agreement with Tenneco also included the transfer of the Harvester brand name along with the farming equipment business. This resulted in the corporation changing its name in 1986. The company would now be called Navistar, and the main product line would still be branded as International Trucks. Workers in Springfield and Fort Wayne would now have a new name on their paychecks.
When I started, it was International Harvester. My first paycheck was International Harvester, but then very quickly it changed to Navistar. But a lot of people didn't realize, even in Fort Wayne, that this engineering center was still around. We did all the engineering for Navistar. You know, the trucks were built in Springfield and Chatham, Ontario at that time, but all truck engineering was done here in Fort Wayne.
Not only was the same kind of engineering, design, and testing being done at the Truck Development and Technology Center, but the proving grounds remained in operation as well. The newly rebranded Navistar had emerged on the other side of the storm, a leaner, if not stronger, organization. The corporation had gone from 47 manufacturing facilities in 1980 down to just 8 plants in 1986. In October of 1986, Navistar reported a $2 million profit. It had been 6 years since International Harvester last recorded a profit. The 750 employees remaining at Navistar's Fort Wayne operations received the good news with guarded optimism.
The mood was one of cautiousness, I would say. I can't tell you how many times people said, prepare for layoff. Everyone who's worked at Harvester has been laid off. Literally, there was no one with less than 20 years service that was still working here. People were still looking for a home. in 86. And we were starting to bring people back. And so there's people who were laid off with less than 20 years experience that were starting to get rehired.
Many engineers were able to come back and work long careers for Navistar in Fort Wayne. The engineering and design jobs stayed until 2012, when operations were moved to Navistar headquarters in Lisle, Illinois. 1,400 jobs were affected, and only 300 employees accepted offers to transfer out of state. It had been 29 years since the last truck was assembled in Fort Wayne, but there was still important work being done here during those years. The proving grounds continued to test trucks. It would be another 5 years before the last International truck made the final lap around the track in 2015. Operations were transferred to a larger facility built by Studebaker near South Bend in New Carlisle, Indiana. After all was said and done, International Trucks had a total run of 92 years in Fort Wayne. Harvester had said goodbye to the city, but this truck town wasn't quite ready to say goodbye to the trucks that were made here. Those who had worked here in Fort Wayne felt like the legacy wasn't being preserved. Many of the current residents weren't aware of the history that had taken place here over the last 100 years. Something had to be done before the memories had faded away. In 2019, a small group of individuals started planning a reunion of sorts to bring those memories back to the attention of the Fort Wayne community.
Harvester Homecoming is really the brainchild of Ryan Duvall. He said, I'd like to do something to help restore International Harvester and the history here in Fort Wayne, because nobody was doing that. And I said, oh yeah, you know, I'll be glad to help you. I'm thinking in my own mind, yeah, this ain't going anywhere. Lo and behold, that very year, we were putting together the first Harvester Homecoming.
In June of 2019, planning for a Harvester Homecoming event was underway. The group began contacting former employees, scout collectors, and big truck enthusiasts to bring their vehicles to the event.
This crazy guy had a wild idea, and it worked. It worked, and I said I'd be there, and I was there. I could not believe the people that showed up the first year for the Harvester Homecoming. It was phenomenal. Had to wait to get in the buildings. I mean, people all over the place, and the scouts that showed up. That gives me goosebumps just talking about it, because it was a get-together, and I'm not the only one that loves Internationals, because everybody else that was there loved International Harvester too, or they wouldn't be there.
I think it blew all our minds as to how it went. Nothing like we were prepared for.
The first Harvester Homecoming in August of 2019 brought out thousands of people wanting to see the hundreds of vintage International Harvester Scouts and trucks on display.
Harvester Homecoming has become an annual festival, drawing thousands of enthusiasts from all across the country.
Navistar responded by loaning its corporate collection of historic vehicles. The festival was even able to utilize the old Scout factory grounds. The vacant engineering center was brought back to life as former employees and their relatives walked the halls once more, sharing tales of what went on at the facility.
Harvester Homecoming was a perfect name for it, because it wasn't just about International Harvester in Fort Wayne. It was about the people. It was a family.
It is like coming home again and seeing all these people and the memories that are out there.
To me, they were the good old days, so it's fun.
It's just wonderful to hear all the stories from the different people.
It's the people, the stories. You know, how things happened in the plants, what was going on, and what was your relationship with International, or you know, what job did you do?
The trucks themselves can be a source of great nostalgia, especially when there's a family connection.
All these old guys would walk up to one of the old trucks and spend 15 minutes walking around it and staring at it. And I said, what are you thinking? What is, you know, does this bring back memories? And the first words out of everybody's mouth after I asked that question was my daddy. My daddy drove one of these trucks. My daddy used to let me ride in it. My daddy, whether it was on the farm or whether it was a highway tractor, and it's a sentimental, I think that's who it is that collects these old trucks, is it brings back some childhood memories.
When you're doing a design, the last thing in the world you think about is that someone's still going to appreciate or have any interest in it 30 or 40 years later.
There's not a whole bunch more things that are more important to me in my life than preserving international truck history. It's what I live and breathe for.
On February 15, 2024, Scout Motors, a subsidiary of Volkswagen, broke ground on an 1,100-acre facility in Blythewood, South Carolina, for the manufacture of a new line of electric SUVs, which will resurrect the Scout name and pass on the legacy to a new generation. Harvester Homecoming has plans for the creation of a permanent museum to spark new connections and memories for future generations.
That is very important, and I think that's going to make it live on, and I think it will.
For those who spent a good portion of their lives here at the Fort Wayne Works, the memories remain strong.
I liked it. I tell you, I just loved the smell. I liked the noise. I liked the people.
We worked hard, and sometimes we would help each other because, you know, the line kept moving.
People worked hard, but we also had a lot of good times.
We not only worked together, we played together.
We had a close relationship,
There was just a lot of camaraderie.
sometimes lifelong friends.
We all became very tight, close friends.
It was a family here.
I enjoyed being around them. I forgot a lot of their names.
These folks went through something pretty serious, and a lot of them, you know, had been laid off, but they loved this company. And that love of a company, you know, you just don't see that in today's environment. You know, it was just a unique time in history, I think, in the history of the company.
It was a great company to work for.
It was a tremendous company to work for.
I was just tickled to have a job with them.
A great place to work.
It was a good place to work. Good people to work with.
Time I started, it was like a family.
I loved working for Harvester. I still call it International Harvester, even though it changed to Navistar. But I'm very proud to have worked for them.
I loved working here. It was always my goal to work at Harvester.
It's just really fun. And we just really enjoyed every day and the opportunities and the surprises. There were always surprises.
Enjoyed all the years with Harvester. It was hard work, but the company treated us well.
It's what kept food on the table and a roof over my head.
Give me my home. They gave me my food.
I raised 3 girls, put them through college.
I had 4 babies and a lovely wife, and we were from good old Fort Wayne, and I was where I wanted to be, you know.
And I'm glad I stayed there. Certainly when I came to Fort Wayne, Indiana, which I knew very little about, to work for a truck company, I assumed I'd be here 2 years and go off to some wonderful place like Detroit or something. And it just kept getting better and better. And there was more and more reason to stay, and never really seriously thought about leaving when you come right down to it.
I can't explain how blessed we were to have the engineers we had and the understanding they had of the product in this facility, in this location.
Very central to my whole life.
I was able to spend 40 years there and enjoyed every minute of it.
I'm so blessed that I got to experience that kind of work environment with those people.
Love them people. And it's like a home away from home.
I'm just real thankful that I got the privilege of working at International Harvester, Navistar, and it gave me a good life. So.
I'd say it was probably the best place to work, and
we were very proud of the product that we produced.
Harvester was my life.
As long as memories are passed on and passionate people continue to restore and care for the vehicles that were born here, Fort Wayne will
always remain a truck town.
Trucktown, A History of International Harvester in Fort Wayne, was brought to you by
Hanning & Bean, a commercial real estate and property management firm invested in the development of Northeast Indiana. Proud to support PBS Fort Wayne in preserving the legacy of International Harvester.
In 1935, Three Rivers Federal Credit Union began as a financial cooperative for the hardworking employees of International Harvester, committed to supporting the people, places, and ideas that make our region home. ThreeRiversFCU.org.
O'Rourke Schoaf Family Foundation, proud to bring the International Harvester story to the community.
Additional funding provided by Kester's Body and Frame Shop, Selking International Trucks, and the City of New Haven.